The sun over West Texas was a merciless god, hammering the cracked earth into submission. For Elias Thorne, it was just another penance. He squinted at the horizon, his face a roadmap of hard miles and harder memories, the lines etched around his eyes deeper than any canyon. His ranch wasn't much, a clapboard house that groaned in the wind, a leaning barn, and 100 acres of scrub and dust that fought him for every blade of grass. It was a kingdom of regret, and he was its solitary king. He finished mending the last stretch of fence, his hands, though calloused, moving with an old familiar precision. Every task was a ritual, a way to keep the ghosts at bay, the ghosts of a woman's laughter and a little girl's hand in his. He'd been a U.S. Marshal once, a man who believed the law was a shield. But the shield had shattered, and the pieces had cut his life to ribbons. Now, the only law he answered to was the rising and setting of that unforgiving sun. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Rook, nickered softly as he approached. Elias ran a hand down the animal's flank, the simple, living warmth a small comfort in his cold world. "Just you and me, boy," he murmured, his voice raspy from disuse. He needed supplies. The thought of riding into redemption was a bitter one. The town was a constant reminder of the world he'd left behind, a world of people, noise, and expectations. He saddled Rook and began the slow 3-hour ride. Redemption baked under the afternoon glare. Elias tied Rook to the hitching post outside the general store, his movements economical, his eyes scanning everything without seeming to look at anything. It was a habit he couldn't break. Inside, the air was thick with the smells of coffee beans, cured leather, and dust. He gathered his goods, flour, salt, a box of cartridges, and paid the storekeeper with a few clipped words, avoiding the man's curious gaze. As he stepped back into the blinding light, a voice cut through the quiet. "Elias?" He didn't need to turn. He knew that weary, hopeful tone. Sheriff Miller stood on the boardwalk, his tin star a dull glint on his chest. He was a good man, but a naive one. He still believed a star could make a difference. "Sheriff," Elias acknowledged, not stopping. "Heard about the stagecoach up on the North Ridge," Miller said, falling into step beside him. "Third one this month. Feller by the name of Kane, they're saying. His work is clean, too clean, professional." Elias kept walking. "Not my concern." "The hell it isn't," Miller pressed, his voice tight with frustration. "This is your country, too. There's a family, the Jenkinses, settled a few miles from you. Good people from back east, a geologist and his wife and daughter. People like them need protecting. I could use a man like you, Elias. I could deputize." Elias stopped so abruptly that Miller almost ran into him. His eyes, the color of a faded blue sky, were cold as stone. "The last time I wore a star, Miller, it got my family killed. You want to protect people? You do it. Leave me out of it." He swung himself onto Rook's back and rode out of town without a backward glance, the dust rising behind him like a shroud. Miles away, in the labyrinthine canyons that cut through the land, Silas Kane smiled. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were dark and watchful, like a serpent's. He watched as his men finished looting the stagecoach, their movements swift and practiced under his gaze. "Anything of value, Dutch?" he asked, his voice a low, cultured purr that was strangely out of place in the rugged wilderness. His second in command, a mountain of a man with a brutal face, shook his head. "Just the mail bags and a few passenger trinkets, boss. Nothing like you said." Silas dismounted, his boots making no sound on the rock. He walked to the terrified passengers huddled together, their faces pale with fear. He ignored the men and stopped before a portly man in a sweat-stained suit. A banker. Silas could smell the money and desperation on him. "You're a man of business," Silas said, his smile widening. "And business is all about information. I'm looking for information about the Trans-Pecos Railroad shipment. The big one. The one with the payroll and the Eastern gold." The banker stammered, shaking his head. I don't know anything." Silas tutted softly. He drew a long, slender knife from his belt and began to clean his fingernails with its tip. "I dislike being lied to. It's so inefficient. Now, a shipment of that size requires special routing, geological surveys, secure paths through these mountains. Those plans exist. I want to know who has them." The banker's resolve crumbled. "The company hired a private geologist," he whispered, his voice trembling. "A man named Jenkins. He's working out of a homestead near Redemption. He has the maps. All the maps." Silas's smile finally reached his eyes and the effect was terrifying. Thank you for your cooperation." He nodded to Dutch. A single shot echoed through the canyon. Silas didn't flinch. He sheathed his knife, his mind already moving ahead, plotting the next step in the creation of his kingdom. A kingdom built on the bones of men like this. The Jenkins homestead was an island of impossible green in a sea of brown. Watered by a stubborn creek, Mrs. Jenkins's garden bloomed with defiant color. Inside their small, sturdy home, Mr. Jenkins leaned over a large table, his brow furrowed in concentration as he drew fine lines on a sprawling map. Clara Jenkins sat by the window, a book open in her lap, but her eyes were on her father. She loved watching him work. He saw the world differently than anyone else. To others, this land was an obstacle. To him, it was a story written in layers of rock and time. "Is it almost finished, Papa?" she asked. He looked up, his face lighting up as he saw her. "Almost, sweet pea. This map, this will change everything. It will connect this territory to the rest of the country. It's the key to the future." He lowered his voice. "And it's a secret. The most important secret in Texas right now." Clara felt a thrill of importance. Their small family, here at the edge of the world, held the key to the future. That evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, they sat together on the porch. The air was calm. It was a perfect night, the kind of night that felt like a promise of a long, happy life. It was a promise the West would not keep. Deeper in the wilderness, where the shadows of the mesas grew long, Nita moved like a ghost. She was tracking a mountain lion, not for the hunt, but for the simple, pure focus of it. Her senses were a part of the world around her. She was the wind rustling the leaves, the heat rising from the rock, the silence in the deep places. Her bare feet found the tracks she was looking for, but they were not the lions. They were the tracks of shod horses, many of them, moving fast. Careless, a branch was broken unnaturally. A patch of moss was scraped away by a spur. She knelt, touching the disturbed earth. There was a wrongness here, a disrespect. For weeks she had sensed this new presence in her lands, a shadow that moved with greed and violence. They were the ones who fouled the water holes and left their kills to rot. She called them the wrong men. She rose, her face impassive, and began to follow their trail. She did not know who they were or what they wanted. She only knew they did not belong here. And it was her duty, the only duty she had left, to watch the shadows. In his clinic in Redemption, Dr. Alastair Finch washed his hands. By day, he was the picture of gentle competence, setting a boy's broken arm, calming a feverish child. He was respected, even liked. But night brought different patients. A soft knock came at his back door, the one that opened onto the dark alley. Finch's heart began to pound. He dried his hands, took a deep breath, and opened it. One of Kane's men stumbled in, clutching a bleeding shoulder. "The boss sends his regards," the man rasped as Finch guided him to the examination table. "Says to tell you, he'll be needing you again soon, for a bigger job. Says you should be ready." As Finch cleaned the wound, his hands trembled. The man reeked of gunpowder and cheap whiskey. Finch had thought a small gambling debt was the worst of his problems. Now, that debt had chained him to the most dangerous man in Texas. He was a healer, sworn to preserve life. But every bandage he wrapped, every bullet he extracted for Silas Kane's men made him a partner in their campaign of death. He stitched the man up in silence, his own future feeling as dark and infected as the wound beneath his fingers. The attack came after midnight, under a sliver of moon. They descended on the Jenkins homestead not like men, but like wolves. The first sign of trouble was the sudden, terrified barking of their dog, cut short by a sickening thud. Mr. Jenkins was out of bed in an instant, a rifle in his hand. "Clara! Your mother! Hide!" But it was too late. The front door splintered inwards. Figures filled the doorway, backlit by the cold moonlight. Silas Kane stepped through them, his smile a pale slash in the darkness. "The maps, Mr. Jenkins," he said calmly, as if inquiring about the weather. The next few minutes were a blur of shouting, splintering wood, and screams. Clara scrambled into the small root cellar beneath the kitchen floorboards, pulling the heavy rug over the trapdoor just as heavy boots thudded above her. She huddled in the damp, earthy darkness, listening to the sounds of her world being torn apart. She heard her father's defiant shout, followed by the deafening blast of a gunshot. Then her mother's scream, a sound that would haunt her for the rest of her life, cut short. Silence. Then, Kane's voice, directly above her. Find them. Burn everything. She held her breath, tears streaming down her face, her body shaking uncontrollably. She heard them ransacking the house. A few moments later, a strange crackling sound began, and the smell of smoke filled her hiding place. The floorboards above her creaked. Someone was kneeling. The rug was pulled away. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, ready to die. "Clara!" A choked whisper came through the cracks. It was her father. His voice was faint, gurgling. "Take this. It's a copy. Go to the lawman, the one who left Thorn. Trust. No one else." Fingers, slick with blood, pushed a rolled-up piece of oilcloth through a crack in the floorboards. She grabbed it. It was still warm. "Papa?" she whispered. There was no answer. The heat intensified. The smoke was becoming unbearable. She waited for an eternity, listening to the roar of the fire and the triumphant whoops of the gang as they rode away. When she finally pushed the trapdoor open, she emerged into an inferno. The house was a blazing pyre. She crawled out into the night, clutching the map, her lungs filled with smoke, her heart a hollowed-out cavern of ash. She was alone. In the unforgiving heart of the Wild West, Clara Jenkins had just been born again, not in water, but in fire. Word of the fire at the Jenkins place reached redemption by mid-morning, carried by a passing vaquero who had seen the pillar of smoke staining the dawn sky. The news spread through the town like a contagion, a fresh wave of fear in a community already on edge. For Elias Thorne, nursing a cup of bitter coffee at his own quiet table, the news was a stone dropped into the still, dark waters of his soul. He told himself it wasn't his business. He had drawn his lines, built his walls. But the image of the family he'd seen in his mind, the hopeful geologist, the wife, the daughter, refused to fade. It was the echo of another fire, another loss. With a curse that was half a prayer, he kicked his chair back, left his coffee untouched, and went to Saddle Rook. The smell hit him first, a quarter-mile out, the acrid stench of burnt pine and something else, something sickeningly sweet that he knew all too well. The homestead was a blackened skeleton against the stark blue sky. The house had collapsed into a smoldering ruin. The garden was a scorched patch of earth. Sheriff Miller and a few townsfolk were already there, their figures small and helpless against the scale of the destruction. Elias dismounted, his eyes taking in the scene with the cold, practiced gaze of a man who had read stories in blood and ash before. He saw the tracks of a dozen horses, the deep prints of heavy men. He saw the shell casings glinting in the sun. This was no accident. This was an execution. "God Almighty, Elias," Miller said, his face pale. "It's a massacre. Found him, Mr. Jenkins, by the doorway, his wife in the main room. We can't find the girl." Elias didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the barn, the only structure still partially standing. He walked towards it, ignoring Miller's call. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of hay and horses. And there, sitting on an overturned bucket in a sliver of sunlight from the open doors, was Clara. She wasn't crying. Her face was smudged with soot, her dress torn, but her eyes were wide and eerily calm, as if she had stared into the heart of the sun and it had burned all the tears out of her. In her hands, she clutched a small, soot-stained oilcloth roll. She looked up as he entered, her small frame tensing. She recognized him, the quiet man from town, the one her father had spoken of. They took everything," she said, her voice a fragile whisper, "and then they burned it." Elias knelt slowly, so as not to spook her. He saw the intelligence behind the shock in her eyes, a strength she probably didn't know she possessed. "I know," he said, his voice softer than he intended. Sheriff Miller appeared at the doorway. "Clara, thank the Lord. Child, are you hurt? We'll take you back to town. We'll look after you." Clara flinched at his loud, hearty tone. Her eyes darted from the sheriff's well-meaning face to Elias's grim, quiet one. Her father's last words echoed in her mind. Trust no one else. She made a decision. She looked directly at Elias, her gaze unwavering. "They were after this," she said, holding out the oilcloth roll. "My father gave it to me. He said to give it to the right man." Elias took the roll. He unfurled it. It was a map, intricately detailed, covered in geological notations and survey lines. He understood instantly. This wasn't about a few dollars or some stolen cattle. This was about something much bigger. He looked at Clara, then at Miller, who was peering at the map with a confused expression. Elias rolled it back up and tucked it into his coat. "The girl comes with me, Sheriff," Elias stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Now hold on, Elias," Miller sputtered. "That's evidence, and she's a witness. She needs protection. She needs to be in town where it's safe." Safe? The word came out like a shard of glass. Was her family safe? This wasn't done by common drifters, Miller. Whoever did this will come back to make sure there are no witnesses left. The safest place for her is the one place they won't think to look, on their trail. He looked at Clara. "Can you ride?" She nodded, a flicker of fire returning to her eyes. "I can." Ignoring Miller's protests, Elias found a gentle mare in the barn that had survived the chaos, fashioned a makeshift bridle, and lifted Clara onto its back. As they rode away from the smoldering ruins of her life, she didn't look back. The first 2 days were a blur of dust and exhaustion. The trail left by Kane's gang was easy to follow at first, a wide scar on the landscape, but Elias knew it wouldn't last. He was grim and silent, pushing them both hard. He taught Clara the essentials with brusque efficiency: how to hold the reins to conserve the horse's energy, how to fire the small Remington pistol he took from his saddlebag, not with the aim of hitting a man, but of being able to make a loud noise if she needed to. "You don't shoot to kill," he told her, his voice flat as he handed her the weapon. "You shoot to survive. There's a difference." Clara was a fast learner. The grief was a constant, cold weight in her chest, but it fueled a resolve she never knew she had. The pampered girl who read books was gone, burned away with her home. In her place was a survivor. She cleaned the pistol every night, watched every move Elias made, and never once complained. On the third day, the trail began to splinter as the gang split up. Elias's skills, rusty from years of disuse, were tested. He lost the main trail once, wasting half a day backtracking in the blistering heat. Doubt began to creep in. He was older, slower. The ghosts of his past weren't just in his memory, they were in his bones. That night, they made a cold camp in a small box canyon. The fire was small, just enough to keep the chill at bay. The vast, star-dusted sky offered no comfort, only a crushing sense of insignificance. As Clara slept fitfully, Elias kept watch, the weight of his responsibility to the girl heavier than any star he had ever worn. The first sound was a low growl from the darkness beyond the firelight, then another. A pair of yellow eyes glinted, then another pair, and another. Coyotes, a large pack, emboldened by hunger. Elias slowly drew his Colt, its familiar weight a grim comfort. He stood, placing himself between the fire and Clara. There were too many for a few shots to scare away for long. This was going to be messy. He was raising his pistol when a sound, no louder than a sigh, cut through the air. Thwip. One of the pairs of eyes vanished with a yelp. Thwip. Another followed. The pack, confused and suddenly spooked by a threat they couldn't see, scattered back into the darkness. Elias froze, scanning the canyon rim. He saw nothing. No movement, no silhouette against the stars. "You can come out," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'm obliged to you." For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, a figure detached itself from the shadows of the rock wall, moving with a fluid grace that was more animal than human. It was a woman, dressed in buckskins, with a bow in one hand and long dark hair that fell over her shoulders. Her face was a mask of stoic neutrality, her dark eyes missing nothing. It was Nita. She stopped 20 feet from the fire, her gaze sweeping over Elias, then Clara, then their camp. It was a look of assessment, of judgment. "You make too much noise?" she said. Her voice was low, melodic, but held an edge of stone. "You travel like you want to be found." "We're tracking a group of men," Elias said, not lowering his pistol completely. "They rode through here 3 days ago." "The wrong men," Nita stated. "It wasn't a question. I have been following them, and you." Clara, now awake and sitting up, spoke. "They killed my family." Nita's gaze softened for a fraction of a second as she looked at the girl. She saw the fire behind the grief. "They dishonor the land," she replied. "They kill without need. They are a poison." Elias saw his opening. "We have a common enemy, then." "Your enemy is not my enemy," Nita said, her gaze hardening again as she looked at Elias. "You are one of them. You build your fences and scar the earth. Why should I help you?" "Because we can't do it alone," Clara said, standing up. "And neither can you. There are too many of them. But together, we can bring them to justice." Nita looked at Clara for a long time. She saw a spirit that, like her own, had been forged in loss. She saw a bridge between the two worlds she was caught between. She looked back at Elias, at the ex-lawman whose hands knew violence, but whose eyes held a deep sadness. They were broken, these two, but a broken arrow can still fly true. Justice is a white man's word, Nita said finally. I do not seek justice. I seek balance. She looked towards the trail where Cain's men had ridden. I will guide you. I will teach you how to move without being heard and see without being seen. In return, when we find them, I will have my due. The poison must be cleansed from the land. Elias holstered his Colt. He knew he was making a pact with a force of nature he couldn't possibly understand. But looking at the determined girl beside him and the deadly, silent woman before him, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't hope. It was something sharper, more dangerous. It was a chance. To travel with Nita was to unlearn the world. Under her silent tutelage, the land, which had been a harsh adversary to Elias and Clara, began to reveal itself as a complex tapestry of secrets and sustenance. She taught them that the flight of a hawk could signal water, that the taste of a certain root could quell a fever, and that silence was a language all its own. Elias, a man accustomed to giving orders and reading men, found himself a novice. He watched her, a grudging respect growing in him. She moved through the unforgiving terrain, not with force, but with understanding. He saw the way she would pause to listen to the wind, or touch a plant with a reverence he couldn't comprehend. In turn, he took over Clara's training with the pistol, his lessons becoming less about mechanics and more about discipline. Never draw unless you mean to use it, he'd say, his voice low. And never use it unless there is no other path. Clara absorbed it all, becoming the quiet center between them. She was no longer just the survivor of a tragedy. She was an apprentice to two masters of very different worlds. One night, as they sat by a smokeless fire Nita had built in a rock crevice, Clara asked a question that hung in the air between them. Were you always alone? She asked Nita. Nita stared into the flames for a long time. I was born to two worlds, she finally said. So I belonged to neither. But I was not alone. I had a family. The people. She paused. The world of the white man takes what it wants. It took my father's honesty, and then it took my mother's land. I am what is left. Later, Elias found Clara staring up at the endless stars. She's like him, you know, Clara said softly. My father, he saw stories in the rocks. She sees them in the wind. Elias looked at the girl, at the impossible resilience in her gaze. Your father was a good man, he said, the words feeling heavy and inadequate. And you were a lawman, she stated, not as a question. You were one of the good men, too. Elias felt an old wound twist inside him. There are no good men out here, Clara, he said, his voice rough. Just the living and the dead. Back in Redemption, Dr. Alistair Finch was living in a state between the two. His respectable life was a thinning facade, and the fear of Silas Cain was a constant, cold pressure in his chest. One evening, Dutch, Cain's brutal lieutenant, appeared at his back door again, this time supporting a man with a festering gunshot wound to the leg. He's burning up, Doc, Dutch growled, throwing the man onto the examination table. Cain wants him fixed. We got a big job coming up. Need every hand. As Finch worked, lancing the infected wound, the stench filling the small room, he listened. Dutch, emboldened by whiskey and impatience, was careless with his words. Whole damn plan hinges on getting that train stopped in the right place, he grumbled to the wounded man. Right in the throat of Apocalypse Canyon. The minute she blows, we hit them. They'll be trapped like rats. Apocalypse Canyon. The name sent a chill down Finch's spine. He knew the place. A narrow, winding gorge 50 miles north, a death trap with only one way in and one way out. A train stopped, there would be a sitting duck. It would be a slaughter. That night, Finch couldn't sleep. The faces of the people in town, the children he delivered, the old men he played checkers with, paraded through his mind. They would be on that train. Their money, their future. He was a coward, yes. He was a debtor. But was he a murderer? With trembling hands, he lit a lamp. He took out a piece of paper and dipped a pen in ink. He couldn't write a clear message. It would be a death sentence if it was traced back to him. Instead, he drew a crude map of the railway line. He marked Apocalypse Canyon. Beside it, he drew a serpent, Cain's moniker, and a drawing of a clock, its hands set to 3 o'clock. Finally, he wrote a single word. Boom! He folded the small paper. Now, he just had to find a way to get it into the hands of someone who could understand it, someone far away from the reach of Silas Kane. It was a fool's hope, a desperate gamble, but it was the only move he had left to play. The trio's journey grew harder. They were tested when a sudden flash flood turned a dry gulch into a raging torrent, forcing them to scramble up a rock face. Elias, using his rope and strength, anchored them while Nita found the handholds, her calm instructions cutting through the roar of the water. They survived, soaked and exhausted, but their trust in one another was now forged in shared peril. Weeks into their journey, guided by Nita's unerring sense of direction, they reached the high, desolate country bordering Apocalypse Canyon. "His den is near," Nita said one evening, pointing to a series of jagged peaks that looked like broken teeth against the sunset. "The air feels wrong." They spent the next 2 days moving with extreme caution, hiding their trail, and traveling mostly at dawn and dusk. Finally, Nita led them to a high, hidden ledge, concealed by a stand of ancient, twisted junipers. Below them, nestled in a box canyon, was a sight that made Elias's blood run cold. It was Silas Kane's hideout. It was more than a camp. It was a small, bustling town of outlaws. Tents and lean-tos were scattered across the canyon floor. A blacksmith's forge glowed. Dozens of men, at least 40, Elias estimated, moved with purpose, tending horses, cleaning weapons, playing cards. They were well-armed, well-organized, and disciplined. At the center of it all, like a king on his throne, sat Silas Kane, issuing orders with a quiet, confident authority. From their perch, they watched for 3 days, their stomachs churning with a mixture of fear and hatred. They saw everything. They saw the stolen dynamite being carefully unloaded from a wagon. They saw Kane's men studying what could only be Mr. Jenkins's stolen map. They saw the cold, casual brutality with which Dutch enforced Kane's will. The scale of it was staggering. They were 3 people against an army. A direct assault wasn't just suicide. It was an impossibility. Clara looked at the men below, her hands clenched into fists. "That's him," she whispered, her voice trembling with rage as she pointed to a big, bearded man laughing loudly by the fire. "The one who killed my mother." Elias placed a hand on her shoulder. His own heart pounded with a grim rhythm. He had faced down gangs before, but nothing like this. This was an enterprise, an empire in the making. Nita simply watched, her expression unreadable, her gaze fixed on Silas Kane. She was a predator who had finally found the leader of the pack that had poisoned her lands. As dusk fell on the 3rd day of their watch, they huddled together on the cold ledge, lest the lights of the enemy camp twinkling below like fallen malevolent stars. The weight of their task settled upon them. They had found the serpent's den. Now, they had to figure out how to walk into it and not be devoured. The air on the ledge was thin and cold. Below, Kane's camp was a hive of final preparations. The trio had a plan, born not of confidence, but of sheer desperation. It was a fragile thing, a spider's web thrown against a charging bull. "It's a fool's plan," Elias had said, staring at the crude map Clara had drawn in the dirt. "We are fools to be here at all," Nita had replied, her voice flat. "But the plan uses the land. It uses their arrogance. That is its strength." The plan was a triptych of controlled chaos. Nita would be the ghost. She would slip away to the north end of the canyon and trigger a rock slide, timed to coincide with the train's approach. It was a gamble on geology and timing, designed to look like a natural event, but one that would block the canyon's main entrance and draw a portion of Kane's men away from the primary ambush site. Elias would be the saboteur. His target was the dynamite wired to the rails at the narrowest point of the canyon. He wouldn't try to disarm it. There wasn't time. His goal was simpler and far more dangerous: to sever the main detonator cord just moments before Kane could trigger it, hoping to create a partial blast that would derail the train but not obliterate it. And Clara had the most terrifying job of all. While the chaos raged, she was to get to the coupling mechanism between the freight cars and the passenger cars. If she could release it, the passenger cars could be saved from the main firefight. It was a task that required a steady hand and a cold nerve she wasn't sure she possessed. As dawn broke, they split up. Nita faded into the rocks, leaving no trace. Elias and Clara made their way down the treacherous canyon side, moving from shadow to shadow. "Remember what I told you," Elias whispered to her as they neared the canyon floor. His face was grim, Stay low, move fast. Don't think about anything but the task. The thinking is done. She nodded, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She clutched the heavy wrench Elias had given her, its cold weight a terrifying reality. The train whistle was a lonely cry in the vastness. It was coming. High on the northern ridge, Nita stood beside a carefully balanced rock spire, a keystone in a puzzle of loose scree she had spent the last day preparing. She closed her eyes, listening not with her ears, but with her whole body, feeling the vibration of the approaching train through the soles of her feet. When the feeling was right, she placed her shoulder against the spire and pushed with all her might. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep groan that seemed to rise from the earth itself, the spire tilted. It plunged downwards, striking the slope below it and unleashing a thunderous avalanche of rock and dust. A river of stone poured into the canyon, completely blocking the pass. Down at the ambush site, Silas Kane heard the distant roar. He looked north, his brow furrowed. "What in God's name was that?" Dutch spat. "Rockslide looks like. We're blocked." "Send 10 men to check it out," Kane ordered, his eyes narrowing. "Something feels wrong." It was the diversion they needed. As a group of outlaws rode north, Elias sprinted from his cover. He was a gray blur against the rocks, running towards the spot where he'd seen them plant the charge. He saw the wire, partially hidden in the dust. He was 20 yards away. 10. The train's engine chugged into view at the bend. Kane saw him. "Kill him!" he roared. Bullets kicked up dust around Elias's feet. He ignored them, his focus narrowed to the wire. He threw himself forward, landing hard, his knife already in his hand. He slashed down, once, twice. The thick cord parted. He was a second too late. Kane, seeing his plan unraveling, slammed the plunger down on his detonator. The explosion was immense, but fractured. Instead of a single coordinated blast designed to lift the track, it was a lopsided eruption. The engine buckled, derailed with a horrific shriek of tearing metal, and plowed into the canyon wall, dragging the first 2 freight cars with it. Steam and black smoke billowed into the sky. The ambush had begun. Kane's men, positioned on the canyon walls, opened fire on the train cars. Passengers screamed. Elias, recovering from the blast, began firing his Colt, providing cover. "Clara, now!" he bellowed. Clara ran. The world dissolved into a nightmare of noise and smoke. Bullets whizzed past her head. She kept her eyes locked on her target, the heavy, greasy coupling between the 3rd freight car and the 1st passenger coach. She scrambled under the car, the wrench feeling impossibly heavy. From the canyon rim, Nita notched an arrow. Her targets were not random. She picked the men who were giving orders, the ones firing with precision. An arrow hissed through the air, and an outlaw directing fire from a high rock slumped over without a sound. Another took down a man reloading on a ledge. She was sowing silent, deadly confusion, her arrows appearing from nowhere, turning the outlaw's advantage of high ground into a death trap. Clara reached the coupling. She strained against the massive pin, the metal groaning in protest. It wouldn't budge. Panic seized her. Then she saw him, the big, bearded man who had haunted her nightmares. He was running towards her, his face a mask of fury, recognizing her. "You!" he roared. "The girl from the farm." She fumbled for the pistol Elias had given her. Her hands were shaking so hard she could barely hold it. "You shoot to survive." She aimed, not at his chest, but at his legs, and pulled the trigger. The shot was deafeningly loud. The man screamed and fell, clutching his shattered knee. That scream broke her paralysis. With a surge of adrenaline, she put all her weight on the wrench. The pin gave way with a loud crack. The passenger cars were free. Elias saw it. He gave a shout of triumph, but it was cut short. Silas Kane was walking through the smoke towards him, a pistol in each hand, his face a calm, chilling mask of hatred. The chaotic battle around them seemed to fade away. "The lawman," Kane said, his voice cutting through the din. "I should have known. You have a habit of turning up where you're not wanted." "It ends here, Kane," Elias said, reloading his Colt with practiced speed. "Yes," Silas agreed, a thin smile on his lips. "It does." He lunged, not firing, but tackling Elias, driving him back against the hot metal of a wrecked freight car. The fight was no longer one of bullets, but of brutal, desperate strength. Fists flew. A knife appeared. Around them, the canyon echoed with the sounds of gunfire, screams, and in the distance, the faint but growing thunder of approaching horses. The posse, drawn by the explosion, was coming. But for the two men locked in a life-or-death struggle, there was nothing but the steel in their hands and the murder in their eyes. The silence that followed the final gunshot was more profound than any noise that had preceded it. It was a heavy, breathless stillness, broken only by the hiss of steam from the dying locomotive and the groans of the wounded. Dust and gunpowder smoke hung in the air like a shroud, catching the harsh afternoon light and turning the canyon into a hazy, dreamlike vision of hell. Elias Thorne stood over the body of Silas Kane, the world tilting on its axis. The strength that had surged through him during the fight evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, aching void. The fiery slash across his ribs pulsed with a life of its own, each beat of his heart a fresh wave of agony. He saw the serpent tattoo on Kane's wrist, the intricate scales seeming to writhe even in death. He had won. The serpent was dead. But the victory felt ashen in his mouth. He was vaguely aware of shouting from the canyon entrance. Figures on horseback were pouring in, Sheriff Miller's posse. Their arrival felt anticlimactic, like guests arriving after the feast had turned to carnage. He saw Miller's shocked face, a mask of disbelief, as he took in the dozens of dead and captured outlaws, the wrecked train, the sheer scale of the violence. "Elias, by God, what have you done?" Miller's voice sounded distant, as if coming from across a great valley. Elias tried to form a reply, a sardonic quip about finishing the sheriff's job, but the words wouldn't come. He looked up towards the canyon rim, to the spot where he'd last seen Nita, the spot from which the life-saving arrow had come. There was nothing but empty rock and sky. She was gone, a spirit returned to the wilderness. He managed a single grim thought, "Thank you." Then the ground rushed up to meet him, and the world dissolved into a merciful black. 100 yards away, Clara Jenkins stood over her own demon. The large, bearded man, the one whose laughter had filled her nightmares, the one whose hands had brought ruin to her family, lay at her feet, clutching his shattered knee, his face a pathetic canvas of pain and terror. The Remington pistol felt unnaturally heavy in her hands. It would be so easy, a flick of her finger, an act of vengeance to balance the scales of justice in this godless land. The hot, metallic taste of hatred filled her throat. For Papa, for Mama. She raised the pistol, the hammer clicking back with a sound that seemed to echo off the canyon walls. The man's eyes widened, and he began to babble, pleading for his life, offering money, anything. His words were meaningless noise. Her entire universe had contracted the space between the pistol's sight and the man's terrified face. But then she saw her father's face in her mind's eye. Not his face in his final, bloody moments, but his face as he sat by the lamplight, patiently explaining the stories hidden in the rocks. He was a man of knowledge, of building, of reason. He had given her a book, not a gun. He had taught her to think, not to hate. What would he want her to be? A tear, hot and cleansing, traced a path through the soot on her cheek. Killing this pathetic creature wouldn't make her strong. It would make her a mirror of the evil that had destroyed her. Her strength would be in choosing a different path. With a shuddering breath, she lowered the pistol. "No," she whispered, not to him, but to the ghost of her own vengeance. "No more killing." When the deputies finally reached her, they found a young woman standing tall amidst the carnage, her face set with a resolve as hard as the canyon rock around her. She simply pointed at the man on the ground. "He's one of them," she said, her voice betraying no emotion. "He was at my family's farm." Her part in the violence was over. Her war for survival had just begun. Nita watched from a high, hidden vantage point as the lawman took control. She saw the girl turn away from her mother's killer, a small act of defiance that resonated with a strength Nita understood well. She saw the broken lawman, Elias, being carefully lifted by the posse and placed on a makeshift stretcher. The immediate threat, the wrong men, had been dealt with. The poison was cut out, but as she watched the organized movements of the sheriff's men, the arrival of more officials from the train, the beginning of the process of imposing order and law onto the chaos, she knew this was a victory for their world, not for hers. This event would bring more rails, more towns, more fences. It would push the wilderness, her wilderness, further back. The balance she sought was a fleeting thing. For now, her work here was done. She turned, and without a sound, disappeared into the labyrinth of rock and shadow, leaving no evidence of her presence, but for a few dead outlaws with arrows fletched in a style no one in that canyon had ever seen before. Elias woke to the smell of carbolic acid and clean linen. For a moment, he was disoriented, thinking he was back in another time, another life. He was in a bed, a real bed, and sunlight streamed through a clean window. His ribs were tightly bound, and the sharp pain had dulled to a deep, persistent ache. Dr. Finch was standing by the window, looking out at the street. He looked older than Elias remembered, the weight of his secrets having settled into the lines on his face. "Welcome back to the land of the living, Mr. Thorne," the doctor said without turning. "You were lucky. The knife missed anything vital, but you've lost a fair amount of blood. You'll need to stay off that horse for at least a fortnight." Elias tried to sit up, groaning as the muscles in his side screamed in protest. "Clara? The girl?" "She's fine," Finch said. "More than fine. The railroad officials have been treating her like a queen. Apparently, that map she was carrying saved them millions. There's talk of a substantial reward." Finch finally turned, and Elias saw a packed leather satchel on the floor by the door. "She's been waiting for you to wake up before she decides what's next." The door opened and Clara entered. She was clean, her hair was brushed, and she wore a new dress bought from the general store, but her eyes were different. The youthful naivete was gone forever, replaced by a sober maturity that made her seem much older than her 19 years. The events of Apocalypse Canyon had forged her into something new. "A share?" Elias's voice was a rough rasp. He looked at the heavy leather pouch Clara had placed on the bedside table. The clink of coins inside was a sound of finality, a closing of accounts. "I don't want their money." "It's not their money anymore. It's yours," Clara insisted, her gaze steady. "It's the price of a life, several lives, mine included. What you do with it is your concern." She paused, her expression softening for the first time. "Where will you go?" The question hung in the air, simple and yet impossibly complex. Where does a man with no destination go? Before the fire, before the canyon, the answer was easy. Nowhere. He would have returned to his dusty patch of land and waited for time to erode him. But now, something had shifted inside him. The rust had been scraped away, revealing something sharp and uncertain underneath. "Don't know yet," he admitted, and it was the most honest thing he'd said in years. "West, maybe? See what's over the next rise." "My father would have liked that," Clara said with a sad smile. He believed there was always something new to be discovered. She hesitated, then did something that surprised him. She leaned forward and briefly placed her hand on his weathered one. Her touch was light, but it carried the weight of their shared journey. "Be safe, Elias Thorne." And with that, she was gone. He watched her walk out of the clinic, her back straight, her stride confident. She wasn't fleeing her past. She was walking towards a future she would build with her own two hands. He felt a pang of something that felt dangerously like pride. He was left alone with the silence and the pouch of gold. It was more money than he'd seen in a decade. Enough to buy the finest ranch, to travel in style, to drink the finest whiskey until the ghosts were well and truly drowned. He could disappear. He could become someone else entirely. But as he looked at the pouch, he felt nothing but a profound weariness. It was blood money, no matter how it was packaged. His final visitor of the day was Sheriff Miller. He held a freshly polished U.S. Marshal's star in his palm, its 5 points glinting in the late afternoon sun. "The territorial governor sends his regards," Miller said, his voice filled with an awe that grated on Elias's nerves. "They're calling you the hero of Apocalypse Canyon. They've authorized a new post, Chief Marshal of the entire territory. You'd answer to no one but the governor himself. They want you back, Elias. They want the legend." Elias looked from the star in Miller's hand to the pouch of gold on his table. One represented a past he couldn't return to, the other a future he didn't want. Both were shackles, just made of different metals. He had spent years running from the man he was, the man who wore that star. But out in the canyon, fighting for something other than a memory, he hadn't been that man. He had been someone else. Someone who bled and fought and protected, not for a government or a law, but because it was the right thing to do. That was a man he could live with. He shook his head slowly. "The legend is dead, Miller. Let him stay buried." He picked up the pouch of gold. "See that this gets to the families of the railroad men who died on that train." Miller stared. dumbfounded. Elias, that's a fortune. Are you insane? Probably, Elias said, a faint ghost of a smile touching his lips, but I'll be my own kind of insane, not theirs. Sheriff Miller finally accepted defeat. He left the star on the table, just in case, and walked out, shaking his head at the mystery of a man who would turn down both wealth and power in a single afternoon. Elias was finally alone. He looked out the window as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across Redemption. The town looked peaceful, safe, but he knew that peace was an illusion. The West was never peaceful. It just rested between storms. And as a cool breeze blew through the open window, Elias had the unshakable feeling that another storm was gathering, far out on the horizon. The horizon was 100 miles away, back in the silent, corpse-strewn battlefield of Apocalypse Canyon. The lawmen and the railroad crews had come and gone, taking the living, the wounded, and the valuable dead with them. They left the outlaw dead where they lay, their bodies already beginning to swell under the relentless sun, a feast for vultures and coyotes. But one rider who came through the canyon days later was not a scavenger. He moved with a grim, unhurried purpose, his horse picking its way carefully through the debris. He was a lean, hard man with eyes that saw everything and revealed nothing. He surveyed the scene not with shock or disgust, but with the cold appraisal of a wolf studying a failed hunt. He paid no mind to the lesser bodies. He went straight to the spot near the wrecked engine where the most violent struggle had occurred. There lay the body of Silas Kane. The rider dismounted. He showed no grief, no flicker of emotion. He knelt beside his former leader and methodically searched his pockets, finding nothing of value. Then his gaze settled on Silas's hand. He took hold of the cold, stiff fingers and twisted the heavy silver ring from it. The ring was intricately carved in the shape of a coiled serpent eating its own tail. He pocketed it. Without a backward glance at the body, he mounted his horse and rode east. He rode hard for 2 days and a night, leaving the plains behind and climbing into the jagged or rich mountains. His destination was a place not found on any map, a bleak mining camp known only as the Furnace. It was less a town and more a private, heavily guarded fiefdom, its mines worked by men who had no other place to go. The rider entered a long, smoke-filled building that served as a command post. Men fell silent as he passed, their respect born of fear. At the far end of the room, a large man sat hunched over a table covered in survey maps and assay reports. He was broader and thicker than Silas had been, his face a granite block of scar tissue and hard living. This was Jedediah Kane. The rider stopped before the table and, without a word, placed the serpent ring upon the map. Jedediah Kane did not look up immediately. He slowly finished the line he was drawing. Then, he reached out and picked up the ring, rolling it between his thumb and forefinger. He had given that ring to his younger brother years ago, a symbol of their shared ambition. Silas was the visionary, the charmer, the serpent. Jedediah was the hammer, the bedrock, the force that made those visions possible. Where? Jedediah's voice was a low rumble, like rocks grinding together deep underground. Apocalypse Canyon, the writer said. A lawman, a girl, and a ghost who shoots arrows. Jedediah finally looked up. His eyes were not like his brother's. They held no charm, no cunning serpent's gleam. They were flat, dead, and as cold as a winter grave. He had loved his brother in his own brutal way, but grief was a luxury. Vengeance was a necessity. My brother's plans were too elegant, Jedediah Kane rumbled. He closed his fist around the ring, the metal biting into his flesh. He wanted to build a kingdom. I will build an empire. But first, he looked at the rider, a promise of absolute violence in his dead eyes. I will salt the earth with the bones of those who took him from me. 6 months. In the West, 6 months could be a lifetime or the blink of an eye. For Elias Thorne, it had been a purgatory of quiet labor. He had ridden north into the high, lonely country of Colorado, where the air was thin and the pines clung to the mountainsides like stubborn old men. He'd found a small, abandoned cabin miles from any town, bought it with a few of the coins Clara had forced on him, and set about losing himself in the rhythm of an honest trade. He worked as a carpenter, taking odd jobs from the scattered ranches and the small, nascent mining town of Prosperity. His hands, once so familiar with the cold steel of a Colt, now learned the grain of pine and oak. He built chairs that didn't wobble, fixed roofs that didn't leak, and spoke only when necessary. The townsfolk knew him only as Thorn, a quiet, capable man with haunted eyes who kept to himself. They respected his privacy. In this part of the world, most men had a past they'd rather not discuss. But Peace was a fickle visitor. He had left the ghost of Silas Kane in a Texas canyon, but the specter of his own failure was a more persistent travel companion. Sleep offered no escape. He would dream of his wife's smile dissolving into flames, of his daughter's hand slipping from his grasp. He would wake with his heart hammering against his ribs, the silence of his cabin more deafening than any gunshot. He had found solitude, but not peace. He was a man waiting for a war he prayed would never come, yet somehow knew was inevitable. Hundreds of miles to the south, Clara Jenkins was also trying to outrun the past. The stagecoach rattled along the dusty track of the Butterfield Overland Mail Route, its rhythmic swaying a constant reminder that she was moving forward. She was no longer the soot-stained refugee from a burned-out homestead. She was Miss Jenkins, a young woman of modest means on her way to San Francisco to secure a position as a governess. She looked the part. Her dress was simple but clean, her hair was pinned up neatly, and a book of poetry rested in her lap. But it was a carefully constructed costume. Beneath the veneer of Eastern respectability was a core of tempered steel. She never sat with her back to the door in a way station. She noted every rider they passed on the trail. Her eyes, which now missed nothing, constantly assessed her fellow passengers. A loudmouth drummer from St. Louis, a nervous-looking preacher, a quiet, older gentleman with a neatly trimmed gray beard and spectacles who reminded her vaguely of Dr. Finch. She was trying to become the person her father had wanted her to be, but she couldn't forget the lessons Elias had taught her. In a small, buckskin pouch hidden within her luggage was the Remington pistol, cleaned and oiled. She had practiced with it in secret during her journey, her aim becoming steady and true. She hoped with all her heart she would never have to use it again. But hope was a dangerous luxury in this land. The stagecoach was 2 days out from Santa Fe, winding its way through a desolate stretch of rocky mesas and arid plains. The heat was oppressive. The drummer was snoring loudly, his head lolling on his chest. Clara was trying to focus on her book when a subtle shift in the rhythm of the road caught her attention. A change in the sound of the horses' hooves. She looked out the window. Her blood ran cold. Riders. At least a dozen of them, pouring down from the surrounding mesas, their movements coordinated and predatory. They weren't common bandits. They rode with a military precision that spoke of discipline and a singular, chilling purpose. At their lead was a man on a massive black horse, the lean, hard-faced rider Elias would have recognized from Apocalypse Canyon. The shotgun rider seated next to the driver shouted a warning, a sound immediately cut short by the crack of a rifle. The driver slumped over, and the stagecoach, its team of 6 horses now leaderless, began to veer wildly. Inside, chaos erupted. The preacher shrieked. The drummer woke with a snort. Clara didn't hesitate. She dropped to the floor, pulling the older gentleman down with her. "Stay down," she yelled. Bullets tore through the thin wooden walls of the coach. Glass shattered. The world became a splintering, screaming nightmare. One of the lead horses was shot, and it went down in a tangle of leather and bone. The entire coach lurched violently and tipped, crashing onto its side with a deafening groan of tortured wood and metal. Clara was thrown against the far side of the coach, her head striking the wall. For a moment, stars exploded behind her eyes. Dazed, she pushed herself up, the smell of dust and blood filling her senses. The drummer was dead, a neat hole in his forehead. The preacher was whimpering in a corner. The older gentleman was groaning, a shard of wood embedded in his arm. The coach door was ripped open. The faces that peered in were hard, cruel, and utterly devoid of mercy. "Find the girl," one of them snarled. "Jedediah wants her alive." His eyes landed on Clara. A greasy smile spread across his face. "Well, look what we have here." He reached in to grab her. Clara scrambled back, her hand flying to the hidden pouch in her luggage. It was too far. She was trapped. It was then that the older gentleman moved. With a surprising burst of speed, he grabbed his medical bag. For Clara now saw that it was a doctor's bag, and threw it at the lantern, still swinging precariously from the ceiling of the wrecked coach. The bag burst open. Vials of ether and alcohol shattered against the hot glass. The resulting flash was not an explosion, but a blinding, suffocating cloud of white, acrid smoke that filled the small space instantly. The outlaws choked and staggered back, their eyes streaming. "Go! Now!" the old doctor yelled, shoving Clara towards a splintered hole in the back of the coach. Clara didn't need to be told twice. She crawled through the wreckage and ran. She ran without thinking, her lungs burning, her only instinct to put distance between herself and the chaos. She heard shouts and enraged curses behind her, but she didn't look back. She scrambled up a rocky embankment and plunged into the maze of arroyos and canyons, the unforgiving wilderness her only shield. She was alone, hunted, and hundreds of miles from anyone who could help her. The echoes of Apocalypse Canyon had found her at last. The chemical smoke from Dr. Finch's impromptu weapon dissipated into the hot, dry air, leaving behind a scene of chaos and fury. Harlan, the lean rider who led the ambush, kicked the splintered door of the stagecoach, his face contorted in a mask of rage. They had failed. The mission handed down by Jedediah Kane himself had been simple: intercept the coach, retrieve the girl, kill everyone else. They had succeeded only in the last part. Spread out. Find her. Harlan roared at his men. She can't have gone far. She's a girl in a dress, not a damn Apache scout. His men fanned out, their boots crunching on the rocky ground as they began to search the arroyos. Harlan turned his attention back to the wreckage. He hauled the whimpering preacher out and dispatched him with a single contemptuous shot. Then he dragged out the man who had caused it all. Dr. Finch was slumped against a broken seat, a deep gash on his forehead, bleeding freely into his gray beard. He looked up at Harlan, his eyes surprisingly clear, devoid of fear. He had made his choice, and he knew the price. "You," Harlan snarled, pressing the hot barrel of his pistol against Finch's temple. "That was a clever trick, old man. Who are you? Why protect the girl?" Finch gave a weak, bloody smile. "I am a man who was tired of being a coward," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "As for the girl, she represents something you and your kind will never understand: hope." Harlan stared at him for a long moment, searching for a hint of a larger conspiracy, a trap. He found none. He found only the quiet defiance of a man who had accepted his fate. There was no sport in a man who wasn't afraid to die. "Hope doesn't get you far in this country," Harlan said flatly. He pulled the trigger. Dr. Alistair Finch's journey to California and his quest for redemption came to an abrupt and silent end in the dust of the New Mexico territory. Two of his trackers returned moments later, their faces grim. "The tracks head into the Broken Lands, boss," one of them said. "It's a maze in there. We could lose a week trying to flush her out." Harlan knew he couldn't wait a week. He had to report his failure to Jedediah. The thought sent a colder chill down his spine than any doctor's defiance. "You two," he snapped at his best trackers, "follow her. Don't sleep. Don't eat. Just find her. I want to know where she is at all times. Do not engage. Just track. I'll send word." He looked back at the carnage. It was a messy, incomplete job. Silas would have been displeased by the lack of elegance. Jedediah would be displeased by the lack of results. Harlan wasn't sure which was worse. He mounted his black horse and rode east, a man riding towards a judgment he knew would be severe. In the town of Prosperity, 2 weeks later, Elias Thorne was planning a piece of oak. The clean, sharp scent of the wood shavings was a balm to his senses. The work was simple, honest. You cut a straight line, you sanded a rough edge. The results were tangible. He was beginning to think he could build a life here, one splinter at a time. The news of the Santa Fe stagecoach massacre had trickled into town slowly, morphing with each retelling. At first, it was just a rumor of another robbery. Then came the lurid details: no survivors, a professional job, a coach full of passengers slaughtered. Elias listened to the whispers in the saloon, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. The method sounded familiar: clean, brutal, absolute. He told himself it was a coincidence. The West was full of brutal men. Kane was dead. It wasn't his fight. He tried to push it down, to lose himself in his work. But the knot remained. The truth arrived in the form of a half-dead man, a deputy from a posse out of Santa Fe who had been trailing the stage a day behind. He collapsed in the sheriff's office in Prosperity, his story spilling out between feverish gasps. He spoke of a dozen riders, disciplined as cavalry. He spoke of the utter destruction. And then he said the words that shattered Elias's fragile peace. Elias was in the general store when the town's sheriff, a young, overwhelmed man named Davies, came in to get bandages for the deputy. "Worst thing I've ever heard?" Davies was saying to the storekeeper. "Slaughtered them all. Except one, maybe." The deputy said it looked like a young woman might have escaped into the canyons. God help her out there alone. A young woman. The planer Elias had been inspecting slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet store. All the coincidences, all the whispers, all the nagging feelings in his gut coalesced into a single, sickening certainty. Clara. He straightened up, his face a granite mask. The man who built chairs was gone. The U.S. Marshal, the one he had tried to bury in Texas, was looking out of his eyes again. He walked out of the store, leaving a stunned Sheriff Davies behind. He went to his cabin, but not for his carpentry tools. He went for the oiled Colt, the Winchester, and the box of cartridges he had hoped he would never need again. He saddled Rook, his movements precise and deadly. The war he had prayed was over had never ended. It had only been lying in wait. Harlan rode into the furnace not as a conquering lieutenant, but as a supplicant approaching a wrathful god. The mining camp was more like a fortress now, its operations expanded, its perimeter guarded by hard-faced men armed with rifles, not pickaxes. He went directly to the main building and found Jedediah Kane standing over a massive map of the Western Territories, moving small, carved markers across it like a general planning a campaign. Harlan stood before him, waiting in silence. He did not offer excuses. Jedediah didn't look at him. He moved a marker representing his trackers into the desolate lands east of Santa Fe. "Report," he rumbled, his voice as low and cold as the air in a deep mine shaft. "The coach was taken. The passengers and guards were eliminated," Harlan said, his own voice tight. "The girl escaped." Jedediah stopped moving the markers. He did not raise his voice. He did not turn. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any shouting could ever be. When he finally spoke, his voice was laced with a chilling disappointment. "My brother Silas was a dreamer. He enjoyed the game, the chase. He saw beauty in a well-laid plan." Jedediah turned slowly, his dead eyes pinning Harlan to the spot. "I am not a dreamer. I am a builder, and a builder does not tolerate faulty materials or failed work. You were sent to retrieve a single vital component, and you failed." "We will find her," Harlan said quickly. "My best men are on her trail now." "Your best men?" Jedediah gave a humorless smile. "Your best men let an untrained girl slip through their fingers." He walked to a large cage in the corner of the room, from which a low growling could be heard. Inside were two massive, half-starved dogs, their eyes glowing with feral hunger. "I have better." He turned back to Harlan. "You are relieved of the hunt. You will oversee the ore shipments. It is a job for a man who follows orders, not one who thinks." The dismissal was more brutal than a beating. He then looked at two other men standing in the shadows, men Harlan had never seen before. They were not cowboys or outlaws. They were gaunt, silent figures with the look of true predators. Apache hunters, perhaps, who worked for coin instead of honor. "Find the girl," Jedediah said to them. "The bounty is now doubled. I don't want her hurt badly. I want her brought back here. I want the lawman she runs to and the ghost who haunts the rocks. I want them all to see what happens when you interfere with the building of an empire." He looked back at the map, his gaze sweeping over the vast territory. His brother had wanted to be a king. Jedediah's ambitions were far grander. He would be a force of nature. He would be the rock slide, the flood, the fire. And Clara Jenkins, Elias Thorne, and a ghost in the wilderness were about to become the first to be ground into dust beneath his inexorable advance. The wilderness does not care for grief or fear. It is a world of primal, absolute needs: water, shelter, survival. For Clara Jenkins, every waking moment became a desperate negotiation with this truth. The first 24 hours after her escape were a blur of panicked flight, adrenaline scrubbing her mind clean of everything but the primal urge to run. She scrambled through arroyos, clawed her way up scree slopes, and hid in the shadows of towering rock formations, her heart a wild bird trapped in her ribs. But on the second day, the adrenaline faded, leaving behind a crushing exhaustion and a thirst so profound it felt like her throat was lined with sand. The lessons of Elias Thorne, once abstract concepts practiced in the relative safety of his company, now became a litany for survival. Find high ground to see what's coming. Water flows downhill. The sun is your enemy. She found a trickle of murky water seeping from a rock face and drank greedily, not caring about the grit or the taste. She forced herself to eat a few berries she vaguely recognized from Nita's teachings, praying they weren't poison. The wilderness that Nita moved through like a second skin was, to Clara, a hostile alien landscape. Every rustle in the brush was a snake, every shadow a predator. And she was being hunted. She could feel it. It was a cold prickling on the back of her neck, a sense that she was not alone in the vast, empty landscape. She tried to cover her tracks, using a leafy branch to sweep away her footprints as Elias had shown her, but she knew it was a novice's attempt. She was a city girl playing at being a ghost, and she feared her hunters were the real thing. Her fears were well-founded. Two figures followed her trail with an unnerving, patient ease. They were the men Jedediah had sent, and they were unlike any men she had ever known. They were brothers, known only as the Ash Twins. One was tall and gaunt, the other short and broad, but they moved with a mirrored silence, their dark eyes taking in every detail of the terrain. They were not trackers in the way Nita was. They did not read the land with respect. They dissected it, looking for weaknesses, for the scent of fear. She rested here, the tall one, Kale, said, pointing to a patch of slightly flattened grass behind a boulder. His voice was a dry whisper. Her breathing was fast. See the disturbance in the dust? The shorter one, Ben, knelt and picked up a single dark thread. From her dress, she is fraying, like a rope about to snap. He looked up, his gaze sweeping the horizon. She is trying to go west, towards the setting sun, towards hope. He smiled, a chilling, humorless expression. Good. Hope makes them careless. They didn't hurry. They knew the land was their greatest ally. It would wear her down, drain her strength, and crush her spirit. And when she was at her weakest, they would take her. For 3 more days, Clara endured. The poetry book was long gone, discarded to save weight. Her dress was in tatters, her skin scratched and sunburned. The Remington pistol was a heavy, constant weight on her hip, a last resort she was terrified to use. Once, a mountain lion stalked her at dusk. Her hands shook as she drew the pistol. She didn't aim at the cat. She fired into the air. The deafening blast sent the predator scrambling back into the rocks, but Clara knew the sound was a beacon, a dinner bell for the men who hunted her. She ran for another hour, her lungs screaming, until she could run no more. She found a shallow cave hidden behind a curtain of sun-dried brush, a small fissure in the rock that offered temporary shelter from the elements and the eyes she felt constantly watching her. Huddled in the cool darkness, she finally had a moment to think beyond her next breath, her next mouthful of water. Escape was a fantasy. She could not outrun them. She could not outlast them. Heading west to San Francisco was a fool's errand, a journey to a future she would never reach. The thought did not bring despair, but a strange, cold clarity. She had been running from them. It was time to start running to something, to someone. Elias. The name was an anchor in the storm of her fear. He was north, weeks of hard travel away, but he was her only hope. He was the only man she knew who had looked into the face of this kind of evil and had not flinched. She would not be the frightened prey anymore. She would be the bait. She would lead them north, into the high country Elias knew, and she would bring this war to his doorstep, whether he wanted it or not. With her new purpose came a new resolve. She ate the last of her foraged food, drank the last of her water, and checked her pistol. She had 5 shots left. She would make them count. As she prepared to leave the relative safety of the cave at dawn, she heard it. A small sound, but one that froze the blood in her veins. The soft crunch of a boot on gravel just outside her hiding place. Then another. They had found her. She flattened herself against the back wall of the cave, her heart pounding so hard she was sure they could hear it. She drew the Remington, the cold steel a poor comfort against the sheer terror that gripped her. She could see their silhouettes through the screen of brush, one tall, one short. They were standing there, patient as buzzards, waiting. "We know you are in there, little bird." Kale's whispering voice drifted into the cave. "Jedediah wants you breathing," but he did not say how much. Ben laughed, a low, ugly sound. "Come out now, it will be easier. The sun is about to rise, it gets very thirsty out here." Clara's world narrowed to the small opening of the cave. This was it, the end of the line. She raised the pistol with both hands, the barrel trembling, and aimed at the center of the larger silhouette. She would not die hiding. She would die fighting. She was about to pull the trigger when she saw the tall silhouette stiffen. He looked up, not at the cave, but at the ridge above. A flicker of confusion crossed his features. And then, with a sound like a wet sigh, he crumpled to the ground, the feathered shaft of a black arrow protruding from his throat. The world outside Clara's cave exploded into violent confusion. Ben, the shorter of the Ash twins, whirled around as his brother Cale fell, a choked gurgle escaping his lips. He saw the black-fletched arrow buried deep in his brother's throat, and his face, usually a mask of cruel confidence, contorted with shock and rage. He had no time to process it. A roar of pure fury erupted from the canyon mouth, and a figure on horseback charged into the small clearing. It was Elias Thorne. He didn't ride like a lawman, measured and controlled. He rode like an avenging spirit, his face a thundercloud of grim determination, his colt already bucking in his hand. Ben reacted with incredible speed, diving behind the cover of a large boulder as bullets from Elias's pistol chipped away at the rock where his head had been. The element of surprise was gone. Elias vaulted from Rook's saddle, landing in a low crouch, knowing his horse was too large a target. He was now on foot, in a close-quarters fight against a man whose reputation was whispered in fear around campfires across the territory. From inside the cave, Clara watched, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw Elias, a bastion of hope she thought she'd never see again. But she also saw the terrifying skill of the remaining hunter. This wasn't a saloon brawl. It was a dance of death between two experts. Ben did not use a gun. He drew two long, heavy skinning knives, one in each hand, and began to circle, his movements low and fluid. He was smiling again, that same ugly, confident smile. "So you're the lawman," he hissed, his eyes flicking between Elias and the rocks above, searching for the archer. "Jedediah will be pleased. He likes to collect all the pieces before he burns the board." Elias held his fire, his colt steady. He had 6 shots. The man in front of him was inhumanly fast. He knew he couldn't afford to miss. "You should have stayed in the mountains," Elias said, his voice a low growl. "We go where the money is," Ben sneered. "And your girl there, she's worth a fortune to our boss." He feinted left, then lunged right with a speed that defied his stocky frame. Elias fired. The bullet tore a strip of leather from Ben's vest, but the tracker was already inside his guard. A knife flashed, and Elias cried out as the blade sliced deep into his forearm, forcing him to drop his colt. The pain was searing. Ben pressed his attack, his other knife aiming for Elias's gut. Elias, disarmed and wounded, reacted on pure instinct. He shoved forward, not away, using his body weight to crash into the smaller man. They fell to the ground in a desperate, grunting tangle of limbs. Elias's one good hand gripped Ben's knife-wielding wrist, straining to keep the blade from his throat. Ben was like a cornered wolverine, all muscle and vicious fury. Elias could feel his strength failing, the blood from his arm making his grip slick. Clara saw her chance. Elias was losing. She couldn't let that happen. She pushed her terror down, her hands surprisingly steady as she raised the Remington. She didn't aim for Ben's body. She knew he was moving too fast. She aimed at the ground just beside his head. She pulled the trigger. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet ricocheted off the rocks with a high-pitched scream. The surprise was all it took. Ben flinched, his head turning towards the sound for a fraction of a second. It was the opening Elias needed. With a final, desperate surge of strength, he slammed the tracker's head against a jagged rock. Once, twice. Ben's body went limp. Silence returned to the clearing, broken only by Elias's ragged breathing. He pushed the body off him and staggered to his feet, clutching his bleeding arm. He looked towards the cave, his eyes finding Clara's. He nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, of thanks. He retrieved his Colt and was reloading it when a figure emerged from the rocks above, as silent as the shadow of a hawk. It was Nita. Her bow was in her hand, another arrow resting loosely on the string. Her eyes swept over the scene, taking in the 2 dead trackers, Elias's wound, and Clara, who was now slowly emerging from the cave into the daylight. The 3 of them stood there for a long moment, a triangle of weary survivors. The lawman, the survivor, the ghost. Reunited not by choice, but by the relentless gravity of a common enemy. "You are hurt?" Nita said to Elias. It was a statement, not a question. "I'll live," Elias grunted, tearing a strip of cloth from his shirt to create a makeshift bandage. Nita walked to the bodies of the Ash twins. She knelt and examined their knives, their boots, the strange ritualistic tattoos on their arms. "These are not his usual men," she said, her voice troubled. "These are hunters, men who kill for sport as much as for pay. The new leader is different, more direct." "His name is Jedediah Kane," Elias said, the name tasting like poison, Silas's brother. Clara joined them, looking down at the dead men who had haunted her for days. She felt no triumph, only a vast, chilling emptiness. "They said he wanted me alive. Why?" "Leverage," Elias answered, his mind already piecing together the grim puzzle. "Or bait for me." He looked at her, then at Nita. "This isn't over. This was just them testing our defenses. More will come." "Then we cannot keep running," Nita said, her gaze lifting towards the northern mountains. "A hunted animal that runs in a straight line will always be caught. We must become the hunters now." A new understanding passed between them. Their frantic escape was over. Their desperate journey to find one another was complete. Now, a new, far more dangerous journey began. They weren't just trying to survive Jedediah Kane's wrath anymore. They had to find his den, learn his plan, and face the dragon in its lair. They had to take the war to him. Huddled together in the shadow of the rocks, surrounded by their dead enemies, the three ghosts of Apocalypse Canyon made a silent pact. The hunt had been reversed. The camp they made that night was different. The desperate hunted energy was gone, replaced by a tense, coiled stillness. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows on their grim faces. They had survived, but survival was no longer the goal. "He will not stop," Clara said, her voice quiet but firm as she cleaned the Remington pistol with meticulous care. "We can't just wait for the next set of hunters to find us." "She is right," Nita added, sharpening the edge of a skinning knife on a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone was the only sound for a long moment. A beast that is wounded and cornered does not flee. It builds a higher wall around its den. We need to find this den, this furnace. Elias stared into the fire, his bandaged arm a dull, throbbing ache. They were looking at him, waiting. He was the one who understood the white man's world of greed and violence. He knew that an operation as large as Jedediah's couldn't exist in a vacuum. It needed supplies. Dynamite, ammunition, food, whiskey. It needed a lifeline to the so-called civilized world. And where there was a lifeline, there was a trail to follow. The thought left a sour taste in his mouth. To find that trail, he would have to walk back into the world he had renounced. Not as a lawman bringing justice, but as a man trafficking in whispers and shadows. He would have to seek out the very scum he used to hunt. The gun runners, the claim jumpers, the bounty hunters who sold information for the right price. He would have to pay the price of his own past. "There's a place," he said finally, his voice a low rumble. "A few days' ride from here. It's not on most maps. They call it Scabland. It's a trading post of sorts. A festering sore on the edge of the territory where the law doesn't go. It's where men like Kane get their supplies, hire their muscle, and disappear when they need to. If anyone knows where the furnace is, the whispers will be in Scabland." "Then we go," Clara said immediately. Elias shook his head. "No, I go. You two will find a secure place in the mountains and wait. Scabland is no place for," he trailed off, looking at them. A girl who had survived a massacre and a native woman who could kill a man from 100 yards without a sound. The words, "no place for a lady," died on his lips. They were absurd. "You think we are a burden," Nita said, her dark eyes pinning him. She wasn't angry, merely stating a fact. "You think we are weak. You are wrong. In that town, you are the one who will be walking into a trap. Your face is known. Your past is a scent they will pick up on the wind. You will need eyes in the back of your head. You will need us." "I'm not hiding anymore, Elias," Clara added, her chin set with a stubborn resolve he was beginning to know well. "I'm not the bait, and I'm not a package to be protected. I am part of this, until the end." Elias looked at them, the fierce determination in Clara's eyes, the unshakable calm in Nita's. They were right. Leaving them behind wouldn't protect them. It would only make him vulnerable. He was no longer a lone rider. He was part of this strange, broken pack. "Fine," he grunted. "But in Scabland, you do exactly as I say. You don't talk to anyone. You don't look anyone in the eye. You just watch and you listen. The place eats the careless for breakfast. Their journey to Skabeland was marked by the new dynamic. They were a predator moving with purpose, not prey fleeing in terror. Nita guided them through hidden paths that cut days off the journey, while Elias briefed them on the kind of men they were about to face. He taught Clara how to spot a card cheat, how to read the nervous energy of a man about to draw his gun, how to distinguish between a drunken blowhard and a quiet killer. The most dangerous man in the room, he told her, is never the loudest one. They crested a low, dusty ridge and saw it below them. Skabeland was not a town, it was a scar. A haphazard collection of tents, sod houses, and crude wooden structures huddled around a single massive barn-like building that served as a saloon, general store, and gambling den all in one. The air hung thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, cheap whiskey, and despair. There was no church, no sheriff's office. The only law was the one a man could enforce with the gun on his hip. Elias pulled Rook to a halt. "This is it," he said, his voice grim. "From the moment we ride in, we're being watched. Every move is being judged. Are you worth robbing? Are you law? Are you running from something? Don't give them any answers." They rode down the main thoroughfare, which was little more than a river of mud and manure. Hard-faced men and women with haunted eyes watched them pass. The silence was unnerving. They were outsiders, an anomaly. A grim-faced man with a lawman's bearing, a beautiful young woman whose determined expression didn't fit her fine dress, and a native woman armed with a bow who rode with a pride and stillness that was both unnerving and insulting to the men who saw her. They were a powder keg on horseback. Elias led them to the main building, the Gorgon's Head. He dismounted. "Nita, you stay with the horses. Keep watch. They'll try to steal them the second we're inside. Clara, you stick to me like a shadow. Say nothing. And whatever happens, don't touch the pistol unless I'm already on the ground." Clara nodded, her hand hovering near the small bag where the Remington was hidden. Her heart pounded, but her face was a mask of calm. Elias pushed open the swinging doors of the saloon. The wave of noise, heat, and stench that hit them was a physical blow. The room was vast and dark, thick with smoke from dozens of cigars and oil lamps. 100 conversations in a half-dozen languages created a dull roar. The place was packed with the dregs of the frontier, failed prospectors, army deserters, bounty hunters, prostitutes with dead eyes, and quiet, watchful men who made their living on the wrong side of the law. Every eye in the room turned to them as they entered. The roar of conversation died down to a low, suspicious murmur. They stood there, framed in the doorway, 3 disparate figures who had just walked into the serpent's nest, hoping to find a whisper of the dragon's lair. Elias scanned the room, his gaze moving past the card tables and the long, crowded bar, searching for a face, any face, from his past that he could use to his advantage. He knew that in a place like this, information always came at a price, and that price was often paid in blood. Elias moved through the hostile room with a purpose that parted the sea of suspicious onlookers. He was a predator in his own right, and the lesser jackals in the room seemed to sense it. He led Clara to a small, round table in the darkest corner of the saloon, a spot shielded by a thick wooden pillar, offering a clear view of both the entrance and the long, grimy bar. "Stay here," he murmured, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Keep your back to the wall. Watch my hands. If I touch the brim of my hat, it means trouble is coming. If I take my hat off, it means trouble is here. If that happens, you slide out the back way. Don't wait for me." Clara nodded, her eyes wide, but her hands steady where they rested in her lap. She looked like a lost dove in a nest of vultures, but Elias knew the steel that lay beneath her fragile appearance. Outside, Nita leaned against the wall of the adjacent building, appearing to be half asleep in the shade. But her senses were fully alert. She watched the men who loitered near their horses, noted the weight and make of the guns they carried, and listened to the rhythm of the town. She could feel the tension radiating from the Gorgon's Head like heat from a forge. Something was wrong. The air was charged, waiting for a spark. Inside, Elias made his way to the bar. He ordered a whiskey, the raw, cheap kind that burned all the way down. He didn't drink it. He used the glass as a mirror, its distorted reflection allowing him to scan the room's occupants without turning his head. He saw him after a few minutes. A man huddled at the far end of the bar, his shoulders slumped, his face unshaven. He was staring into an empty glass as if it held the secrets to the universe. His name was Finn, though most knew him as Rattlesnake. Finn, for his habit of striking without warning and his tendency to shed his loyalties like skin. Elias had arrested him once, years ago, for claim jumping. He'd let him go with a warning. He was counting on Finn remembering that small mercy. Elias slid down the bar and stood next to him. "Finn," he said quietly. Finn flinched, looking up with bleary, fearful eyes. Recognition dawned, followed by sheer terror. "Marshal," he stammered. I ain't done nothing. I've been keeping my nose clean, I swear." "I'm not a marshal anymore," Elias said, his voice a low growl. He pushed a silver dollar across the bar. "Buy yourself a drink. I need information." Finn's eyes darted nervously around the room. He snatched the coin and signaled the bartender. "Information's dangerous, Thorne, especially round here. I'm looking for a mining operation. A big one, well guarded. Calls itself the Furnace." Finn choked on his whiskey, sputtering. He wiped his mouth, his eyes wide with genuine panic. "You're crazy," he hissed, leaning closer. "Don't even say that name in here. The walls have ears, and most of them belong to Jedediah Kane." "Then you know him." "I know of him," Finn corrected, his voice barely a whisper. "Everyone knows of him. He's a ghost, a devil. He runs the biggest silver strike in the territory, but he don't sell his ore through normal channels. He has his own smelters, his own transportation, a private army. The man's building a kingdom up in the mountains." "Where?" Elias pressed, sliding a heavy gold coin onto the bar, one of the ones Clara had given him. Finn's eyes fixated on it like a starving dog on a steak. I don't know exactly," Finn stammered, his greed warring with his fear. "Nobody does. It's in the Dragon's Tooth range, a place that's impossible to get to unless you know the secret paths. But he gets his blasting powder and his food shipments through a middleman. A man named Cortez runs a freight business out of Santa Fe, but he's a phantom." Finn's voice trailed off. The saloon doors had swung open again, and the low murmur of the room dropped a few decibels. A new figure stood silhouetted against the harsh afternoon light. He was a tall man, impeccably dressed in black from his polished boots to his flat-brimmed hat. A long, dark coat fell to his knees, and on each hip rested a pearl-handled Colt in a tied-down holster. His face was sharp and intelligent, with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes as gray and cold as a winter storm. But it wasn't his dress or his guns that commanded the room's attention. It was the air of absolute, lethal confidence he carried with him. Elias felt a cold dread settle in his gut. He knew this man. Silas Blackwood. The most successful and feared bounty hunter in 3 territories. A man who hunted other men not just for money, but for the sheer sport of it. A man who never forgot a face. Blackwood's gray eyes scanned the room, and for a heart-stopping second, they locked with Elias's. There was a flicker of recognition, a slight, almost imperceptible widening of his eyes, followed by a slow, predatory smile. Finn saw the look and seemed to shrink into himself. "God help us," he whispered, downing the rest of his whiskey in one gulp. "That's Blackwood." Ignoring everyone else, Blackwood moved with a fluid, unhurried grace through the crowded room, heading directly for the corner table where Clara sat alone. Clara, seeing him approach, felt her blood turn to ice. She remembered Elias's words, kept her eyes down, and prayed he would pass. He did not. He stopped at her table, removed his hat with a flourish, and gave a slight bow. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that was more menacing than any growl. "A lovely flower such as yourself seems terribly out of place in this garden of weeds. I trust you are not alone?" Before Clara could answer, Elias was there. He moved from the bar to the table in 3 long strides, positioning himself between Blackwood and Clara. "She's with me," Elias said, his voice flat and hard. Blackwood's smile widened. "Thorne," he said, as if greeting an old friend. "I thought I recognized the stoop of a man carrying the weight of the world. It has been a long time. I heard you'd retired, planted a garden, found God." "You heard wrong," Elias said. Clearly, Blackwood's gaze flickered to Clara, then back to Elias. "This must be your niece." The way he said the word was an insult, a challenge. "I'm surprised to find you so far from Texas, and in a place like Scabland, of all cesspits. Surely you're not here on official business? As you said, you're not a marshal anymore." Elias felt the trap closing. Blackwood was playing with him, enjoying the tension. A single wrong word, a single hostile move, and this saloon would erupt in a bloodbath. He was standing on a mountain of black powder, and Silas Blackwood had just walked in holding a lit match. Elias Thorne felt the weight of every eye in the saloon. The air was thick enough to chew. He knew that Blackwood wasn't just making conversation, he was dissecting him, looking for the angle, the profit. A man like Elias Thorne didn't show up in a place like Scablin without a very good reason, and Blackwood intended to own that reason. A man has to be somewhere, Elias said, his voice level. He didn't sit. Standing gave him a slight advantage, a readiness that sitting would steal. My niece and I are traveling to meet her kin up in the Colorado Territory. This was just a stop for water and a hot meal. Blackwood's gray eyes twinkled with amusement. He leaned back in his chair, a picture of relaxed danger. "Your niece," he repeated, savoring the word. "Of course. And I suppose you just happened to stop in the one establishment between here and Colorado that serves the deadliest whiskey and the worst odds. A man of your experience must have known that." He gestured to an empty chair. "Sit, Thorne. Have a drink with me. For old time's sake, we can discuss the bounties currently posted. Perhaps we're hunting the same rabbit." It was a test. To refuse was an admission of having something to hide. To accept was to sit at a table with a shark. Elias made his choice. He pulled out the chair for Clara, a gesture of a protective uncle, before taking a seat himself. He kept his gun hand-free beneath the table. "I'm not hunting anymore, Blackwood," Elias said, his voice low. "I'm retired. You said it yourself." "No one ever truly retires from this life," Blackwood countered smoothly. "The ghosts don't allow it. They follow you. I find it's better to make new ghosts than to be haunted by the old ones." His gaze was fixed on Elias, but his words felt as though they were aimed at the whole room. It was a declaration of his own philosophy, his own deadliness. Clara sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. She projected an aura of frightened fragility, a young lady utterly terrified by her surroundings. It was a masterful performance. She looked at Blackwood with wide, fearful eyes, then looked away as if unable to meet his gaze. She was playing the part Elias had assigned her to perfection. The tension was a living thing, coiling tighter with every passing second. At the bar, Rattlesnake Finn looked as if he was about to faint. He knew Elias was here for information on Kane. He knew Blackwood's arrival had turned his simple transaction into a death sentence. Outside, Nita felt the change. The steady, dull roar of the saloon had become a focused, watchful silence. The men who had been loitering near her horses had subtly shifted their positions, their hands now resting casually on the butts of their pistols. They weren't just watching her anymore. They were waiting for a signal from inside. She slipped her hand to her bow. She couldn't see what was happening, but she could feel the pressure building. It was time to release it. With a movement too quick to follow, she snatched a half-empty bottle of whiskey from a nearby table where two drunks were sleeping. She took a step back and hurled the bottle with all her might into the middle of the dusty street. It shattered with a loud crash. Then she let out a piercing war cry, a sound so fierce and unexpected that it cut through the afternoon haze like a knife. She immediately ducked back into the shadows. The effect inside the saloon was instantaneous. Every man, Blackwood included, turned towards the sound. Shouts erupted outside. Men at the bar rushed to the doors to see what was happening. It was the chaos of a kicked-over anthill. In that single perfect moment of distraction, Blackwood's attention was off them. Elias looked at Finn and tapped the gold coin on the bar with his finger. Finn, desperate to be free, understood. As Blackwood turned his head back, annoyed by the interruption, Elias stood up. "It seems this town is a bit too lively for my niece's constitution," he said calmly. "We'll be on our way." He moved to the bar, ostensibly to pay for the whiskey he'd never drunk. He stood next to the trembling Finn. As he placed a coin on the bar, he whispered, "The name. Now." "Cortez," Finn breathed, his eyes still wide with fear from the commotion. "Miguel Cortez. Runs a freight depot on the south side of Santa Fe. A legitimate front. Now for God's sake, Thorne, get out of here." Elias nodded once. He walked back to Clara, took her arm, and guided her towards the back entrance, the one he had noted when they first walked in. Blackwood watched them go, a thoughtful, calculating expression on his face. He hadn't been entirely fooled, but the distraction had broken his momentum. He had learned what he wanted. Elias Thorne was back in the game, and he was lying about it. That made him interesting. That made him profitable. Blackwood decided to let him go, for now. A good hunter never springs a trap too early. He preferred to let his quarry think they had escaped, to let them lead him to a bigger prize. He smiled to himself and took a slow sip of his whiskey. The game was afoot. Elias and Clara emerged into the back alley. Nita was already there with the horses, her face an impassive mask. "Trouble?" she asked. "The kind that follows," Elias grunted, helping Clara onto her horse. "Let's ride." Hard. They didn't look back. They rode out of Scabland, kicking up dust, and didn't slow their pace until the wretched town was a distant smudge on the horizon. That night they made camp in the high desert, the stars their only witnesses. The air was cold and clean, a welcome antidote to the saloon's filth. "Cortez," Elias said, staring into the fire. "That's our next step, Santa Fe." "Who was that man?" Clara asked, her voice still holding a trace of the fear she had hidden so well. "The one in black." "His name is Silas Blackwood," Elias said, and for the first time, Clara heard something in his voice she had never heard before, a note of genuine concern. "He's a bounty hunter, the best there is, and now he knows we're here." "Is he working for Jedediah?" "No," Elias said grimly. "Worse, he works for himself, which means everyone is his prey. We didn't just walk out of there with a name. We walked out of there with a target on our backs." They had their lead. They had the next piece of the puzzle. But in finding it, they had alerted a new and far more cunning predator to their presence. The clock was ticking louder than ever. The trail to Santa Fe was long and haunted. Every rider spotted on the horizon, every campfire glimpsed in the distance at night was a potential threat. Silas Blackwood was a ghost at their backs, a silent promise of a reckoning to come. They traveled hard, pushing the horses, speaking little. The easy camaraderie born of shared survival had been replaced by a grim, professional focus. They were no longer just a pack. They were a unit with a mission. Nita's skills were more crucial than ever. She led them through ancient, forgotten pathways, trade routes her people had used for centuries that kept them off the main roads and away from prying eyes. She taught Clara to read the signs of pursuit, not just in the dust, but in the anxious flight of birds, in the unnatural silence of a landscape that knew it was being watched by predators. Elias watched them both, a silent observer of the strange bond that had formed between the orphan city girl and the solitary native woman. Clara was no longer his ward. She was Nita's student. She was learning a language older than words, a way of seeing the world that he, for all his experience, could never fully grasp. After nearly a week of hard riding, they saw it. Nestled in a valley at the foot of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, Santa Fe was unlike any place they had seen. It was not a raw, new town scraped out of the dust like Redemption, nor was it a festering wound like Scabland. It was old. Its adobe buildings, warm and earthy, seemed to grow organically from the ground itself. The city hummed with a different kind of energy, a blend of Spanish, Pueblo, and Anglo cultures. The central plaza was a kaleidoscope of color and sound. Merchants selling vibrant woven blankets, the smell of roasting chilies in the air, the musical cadence of the Spanish language mixing with the clipped tones of English and the soft whispers of native tongues. For Clara, it was a glimpse of the world she had dreamed of, a world of culture, history, and possibility. For Elias, it was a labyrinth of alleys and rooftops, a place where a man could be killed in 100 different ways without anyone noticing. For Nita, it was a cage. The press of people, the endless noise, the sharp angles of the buildings, it was a profound assault on her senses. She pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders, her eyes constantly moving, her posture as tense as a drawn bowstring. "We need to find this Cortez," Elias said, his voice low as they found a stable to leave their horses. "But we need to do it quietly. In a city this size, a man with Jedediah Kane's kind of money has eyes and ears everywhere." They spent the first day simply observing, walking the city's narrow streets. It was Clara who found the lead. Posing as a young woman looking to send a package of legal documents back east, she inquired at the main post office. The clerk, a helpful man, informed her that for secure, heavy freight, no one was more reliable than Señor Miguel Cortez. The Cortez Freight Depot, he said, was one of the largest and most respected businesses in the city, located in the sprawling warehouse district near the rail yards. The next morning, they surveyed the depot from a distance. It was exactly as the clerk had described, a fortress of commerce. A high adobe wall surrounded a massive yard bustling with activity. Heavily laden wagons came and went. Teamsters shouted orders, and laborers loaded crates onto freight cars. The entire operation hummed with an air of perfect, unimpeachable legitimacy. "He's hiding in plain sight," Elias muttered from their vantage point on a nearby rooftop. "It's brilliant. No one would ever suspect this is the supply line for a private army." "The walls are high," Nita observed, her eyes tracing the perimeter. "Only 2 gates. Guards on both, more inside. They are not just protecting cargo." "So we can't just walk in and ask questions," Clara stated. "What's our plan?" Elias looked at her. In Scabeland, he had tried to shield her. Here, he knew her intelligence was their sharpest weapon. "Cortez is a businessman," he said. "He deals with clients. You're going to be his newest client." The plan was simple, and that's what made it so dangerous. Clara, dressed in her best traveling suit, would present herself as Miss Annalise Thorne, the niece of a wealthy cattle baron from Texas. She would request a private meeting with Señor Cortez to discuss a large, discreet, and highly profitable shipping contract, the regular transport of mining equipment to a new claim in the Colorado mountains. It was a story designed to appeal to Cortez's greed and guarantee a private audience. Elias would post himself in a cantina across the street, watching the entrance. Nita, using her incredible ability to move unseen, would scale the adobe walls and find a perch on the rooftops inside the compound to observe the depot's inner workings and be their eyes from above. As Clara stood before the imposing gates of the freight depot, she smoothed the front of her dress, her heart pounding. This was not like facing the bearded man in the canyon. That was a primal fight for survival. This was a game of masks and lies, a performance where a single wrong word could be as fatal as a bullet. Elias gave her a final, steady look. "Remember, you are in control. You are the one with the money. He needs you more than you need him. Just get a feel for the man. See if he's a prisoner or a partner in this, and then get out." She nodded, took a deep breath, and walked towards the gate. She presented her card to the guard, who, after a moment's hesitation at the sight of her fine clothes and confident demeanor, allowed her to enter. Elias watched her disappear into the bustling yard. Nita, who had vanished moments before, was already a silent shadow moving across the tiled roofs inside. The gate closed. Clara was alone. She was led through the chaotic yard to a large, handsome adobe building that served as the main office. A secretary asked her to wait, and a few minutes later, she was shown into a surprisingly opulent room. The floor was covered in a rich Navajo rug. The furniture was heavy, dark, and intricately carved, and the air smelled of expensive cigar smoke and leather. A man rose from behind a large mahogany desk to greet her. He was in his 50s, with silvering hair, a well-trimmed mustache, and intelligent dark eyes. He was dressed in a fine suit, and he radiated an aura of wealth and confident power. This was Miguel Cortez. "Señorita Thorne," he said, his voice a smooth, welcoming baritone. He gestured to a chair. "It is a pleasure. Please sit. How can Cortez Freight be of service to your family?" Clara sat, forcing her hands to remain steady in her lap. She looked into the eyes of the man who was the linchpin of Jedediah Kane's empire of violence and terror. She saw no flicker of evil, no hint of the darkness he was a part of. She saw only a powerful, respectable businessman. And that was the most frightening thing of all. At Chapter 9, The Devil's Backbone, Part 2, Başlık Metnin Tamamı. Chapter 9, The Devil's Backbone, Part 2. Clara took the offered seat, the soft leather sighing beneath her weight. She placed her hands in her lap, a picture of genteel composure, and began her performance. She spoke of her uncle, Elias Thorne, a man of considerable means who had recently acquired the rights to a promising silver lode deep in the Colorado mountains. She painted a picture of a vast, untapped resource, a venture that would require a constant and reliable flow of heavy machinery, blasting powder, and other essential supplies. "My uncle is a private man, Señor Cortez," she said, her voice a carefully crafted blend of youthful earnestness and inherited authority. He values discretion above all else. He is looking for an exclusive partnership with a freight company that understands the delicate nature of such operations, a company that can ensure his shipments arrive on time and without attracting undue attention from competitors or other undesirable elements. Miguel Cortez listened intently, his fingers steepled before him. He was the very picture of a shrewd, successful businessman. He nodded, asked intelligent questions about tonnage, routes, and schedules. The initial conversation was a smooth, professional dance. He saw a lucrative, long-term contract, and his eyes held the gleam of a merchant who senses a significant profit. "Your uncle's proposed location is remote," Cortez noted, gesturing towards a large map of the territories on his wall. "The terrain is difficult. Security would be a primary concern." This was the opening Clara had been waiting for. "Indeed," she said, allowing a slight, calculated frown to touch her lips. "We've heard rumors of unrest in that region. Organized gangs. My uncle is willing to pay a premium for a partner who has experience navigating such challenges. Someone who knows how to deal with local warlords, perhaps. Someone like Jedediah Kane." She said the name softly, letting it hang in the opulent air like a puff of gunsmoke. The change in Miguel Cortez was instantaneous and profound. It wasn't a large movement. It was a sudden stillness, a freezing of the confident posture. The warm, intelligent light in his eyes vanished, replaced by a deep, cold fear. The mask of the powerful businessman slipped, and for a fraction of a second, Clara saw the terrified prisoner beneath. He recovered quickly, but the damage was done. "I am not familiar with that name," he said, his voice now tight and formal. "Señorita Thorne, I'm afraid this venture may be too hazardous for my company to undertake. We are a legitimate business. We do not involve ourselves in local disputes." He was trying to end the meeting, to push her away. Clara knew she had to press her advantage, to gamble everything on one final, desperate throw. She leaned forward slightly, her own voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Please, Señor, do not insult my intelligence or the intelligence of the man I represent. We know that you are the exclusive supplier for the operation at the furnace. We simply wish to become another valued client. Surely the serpent has room for one more egg in its nest?" The mention of the serpent, Silas's ring, his symbol, shattered Cortez's composure completely. He shot to his feet, his face pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and confusion. He looked at Clara as if she were a ghost, a specter from a world he desperately tried to keep separate from this one. "Who are you?" he hissed, his voice trembling. "Are you one of his? Is this a test?" "A test of a sort," Clara said, her heart hammering but her voice remaining steady. She stood up, taking control of the room. "We know who you are, Señor Cortez. We know who you work for, and we know that he is planning something much bigger than a simple mining operation. We are here to stop him, and you are going to help us." Cortez laughed, a sharp, broken sound devoid of humor. "Stop him? You cannot stop a force of nature. You think this is about silver? You think this is about money?" He walked to the window, his back to her, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He looked like a man staring into his own open grave. "This is about an empire," he said, his voice barely audible. "Jedediah doesn't want to be a rich man. He wants to be a king. He wants to carve out his own nation from this territory." He turned back to face her, his eyes burning with a desperate, feverish light. "He's going to take the devil's backbone." "The devil's backbone?" Clara repeated, the name sending a chill down her spine. "It is a pass," Cortez explained, speaking quickly now, the words tumbling out of him in a torrent of long-suppressed fear. "A single, vital artery through the San Juan Mountains. The new transcontinental line has to go through it. There is no other way. The engineers have spent years proving it. Jedediah has spent that time fortifying it. He has an army hidden in those mountains. When the time is right, he will seize the pass, cutting off all rail traffic to the West Coast. He will control everything: trade, supplies, the army's movements. He will hold the United States government itself for ransom. It's not a robbery. It's a secession. It's war." The sheer audacity of the plan struck Clara dumb. This was the true scope of Jedediah's ambition. It was madness. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because you are the first sign of hope I have seen in 2 years," Cortez said, his voice breaking. "He has my family. My wife and son. They are kept under guard in a town near the furnace. If I disobey, they die. I have supplied his army, I have laundered his money, I have been his willing dog because I have had no choice." He looked at her, his eyes pleading. "You cannot fight him. He has hundreds of men. He has cannons he stole from an army shipment. But if you are truly going to try, if you are going to face this devil, then know that he has one weakness." What weakness? The pass has only one weakness. A high, narrow trail on the southern ridge, thought to be impassable. An old Ute trail. It is the only way to get above his fortifications. It is suicide to try, but it is the only way. A sharp knock on the office door made them both jump. "Senor Cortez?" A foreman's voice called out. "The shipment for the northern camps is ready." Cortez visibly composed himself, the mask of the respectable businessman snapping back into place. "Thank you, I will be out momentarily." He turned back to Clara, his voice once again cool and professional. "Senorita Thorne, I will have my people review your proposal. We will contact you." It was a clear dismissal. Clara knew she had what she came for. She nodded politely. "Thank you for your time, senor." She walked out of the office, through the bustling yard and out the main gates, her face a pale, neutral mask. She did not look back. She met Elias at the cantina, where he had been nursing a single, untouched beer for over an hour. He saw her face and knew instantly that something had changed. They rendezvoused with Nita in the back alleys of the city. Only when they were safely hidden in the shadows did Clara finally speak, her voice low and trembling as she relayed the terrifying truth of Jedediah's plan. The investigation was over. They had stared into the heart of the serpent's plan and found not a simple scheme of greed, but a vision of fire and war that threatened to consume the entire territory. They now knew the battlefield, a place called the Devil's Backbone, and they knew the odds were impossible. They left Santa Fe at dawn, 3 riders moving as one. The bustling city, with its promises of civilization, faded behind them, and the vast, silent wilderness swallowed them whole. The mood was different now. The frantic energy of the pursued and the tense focus of the investigators were gone. In their place was a cold, hard clarity. They were no longer running or chasing. They were riding to war. The journey north into the San Juan Mountains was a long ascent into a harsher, more primal world. The landscape became a jagged expanse of granite peaks and deep, shadowed valleys. The air grew thin and sharp. This was Jedediah's kingdom, a land that did not suffer fools or the weak. During the long days in the saddle and the quiet nights by the fire, they forged their desperate plan. Cortez's information was their only map. Open quote, "The Ute Trail is our only way in." Elias said one night, sketching a crude map in the dirt with the tip of his knife, "Nita, you'll have to get us to the top without being seen. It's your ground to command." Nita nodded, her eyes fixed on the distant, tooth-like peaks. "The trail is steep, but it is there. The rock spirits will either let us pass or claim us." "Once we're above them," Elias continued, "we split. Nita, you are the ghost again. You'll be our eyes. You take out their artillery, their sentries. Sow chaos from above. Create targets of opportunity." He then turned to Clara. "Jedediah will have his main dynamite stores near his command post. It's his ace in the hole. While I go for him, you go for the dynamite. If you can destroy it, you'll break the back of his entire fortress." "I understand," Clara said. There was no hesitation in her voice. The girl who had hidden in a root cellar was a distant memory. She had been forged into a weapon, and she was ready to be used. "And you?" she asked Elias. "Where will you be?" "I'm going for the head of the serpent," Elias said, his voice a low growl. "A body can't fight without its head. I'm going to kill Jedediah Kane." Close quote. It was a suicide mission, and they all knew it. 3 people against an army in its own fortress. But as they looked at each other around the flickering fire, they saw not fear, but a shared, unbreakable resolve. They reached the foothills of the Devil's Backbone a week later. The sight was even more formidable than they had imagined. The pass was a deep, narrow gash in the mountains, and Jedediah's men had turned it into a fortress. They could see crude but effective fortifications built into the canyon walls, sniper nests perched on high ledges, and armed patrols moving with military precision. At the base of the pass, a sprawling, squalid camp housed hundreds of railroad workers, mostly Chinese and Irish immigrants, living in conditions that were little better than slavery. forced to build the very railroad that would be used against them. Open quote. Cortez was right, Elias muttered, surveying the scene through his spyglass. This is an army. An army of slaves and bullies, Clara countered, her voice tight with anger as she watched a guard brutally beat a worker who had stumbled. There has to be a way to turn them. Close quote. That night, they put the second phase of their plan into action. While Nita scouted the base of the Ute Trail, Elias and Clara, cloaked in darkness, slipped down into the workers' camp. The place reeked of misery and hopelessness. They moved like shadows through the rows of ragged tents until they found what they were looking for. A large tent where the foremen were drinking, their voices loud and angry. They waited until a man, broad-shouldered and with a shock of red hair, stumbled out into the night. Elias stepped from the shadows, his Colt pressed gently against the man's side. Open quote, we need to talk, Elias said quietly. And you need to listen. Close quote. They took the man, the chief foreman, an Irishman named O'Malley, into the darkness. At first, he was defiant, thinking they were more of Kane's thugs. Open quote. Whatever you want, you can go to hell, he spat. We're already there, Clara said, stepping into the moonlight. We're here to offer you a way out. Close quote. Slowly, patiently, they laid it all out. Jedediah's plan to seize the pass, the coming war, their own desperate mission. O'Malley listened, his initial hostility turning to disbelief and then to a slow-burning rage. He was a hard man, but he cared for his crew. He had buried too many of them already, dead from accidents, disease, or the casual cruelty of Jedediah's guards. Open quote, you're insane, O'Malley said when they finished. It's 3 of you against his whole damn army. We are 3, Elias confirmed. But you, he looked at the sprawling camp, are 300. He needs you to build his fortress. He thinks you're beaten. He thinks you're slaves. Prove him wrong. And what's the plan? O'Malley asked, a dangerous glint in his eye. At dawn tomorrow, you will hear a single rifle shot from the South Ridge, Elias explained. That's our signal. It means we're in position. When you hear it, you start a riot. Set fire to the supply wagons. Grab pickaxes, shovels, whatever you can. Create a distraction so massive that every guard in this canyon has to turn their attention to you. Can you do it? Close quote. O'Malley looked back at the camp, at the flickering lights of the tents where his men slept, dreaming of homes they would likely never see again. He thought of the men he had lost. He spat on the ground. Open quote, oh, I can do it, he said, a grim smile spreading across his face. There's a year's worth of rage in this camp just waiting for a spark. You just be sure to give us that signal. We'll give you a fire worthy of the devil himself. Close quote. The alliance was forged. As Elias and Clara slipped back out of the camp, they paused and looked up at the devil's backbone. The jagged peaks were silhouetted against a sea of stars, hacked looking like the spine of some great sleeping beast. At dawn, they would try to break it. They met Nita at the base of the cliffs. She pointed to a nearly invisible crack in the rock face. Open quote, the trail begins here, she whispered. It will test your spirit. Pray you are worthy. Close quote. The 3 of them stood there for a moment, the last moment of peace they would know. Before them lay a climb into darkness, a battle against impossible odds, and the culmination of a journey that had started in fire and blood. The storm was no longer gathering. It was here. The ascent was a vertical nightmare. The Ute Trail was less a path and more a suggestion of one, a series of precarious ledges and crumbling handholds that scaled the sheer rock face of the devil's backbone. They climbed in the pre-dawn darkness, the world a black void below them, the only sounds their own ragged breaths and the whisper of the wind that threatened to tear them from the mountain. Nita moved like a wraith, a creature born of this vertical world. She tested every foothold, every handhold, before allowing the others to follow. She seemed to read the rock's intentions, to know which stones would hold and which would betray them. Elias, for all his strength, struggled, his wounded arm a constant, searing pain. He climbed through sheer grit, his jaw set, refusing to be the weak link. But it was Clara who was the revelation. She climbed with a focused, desperate tenacity, her fear a fuel she burned to keep moving. She did not look down. She looked only at Nita's feet above her, her one point of certainty in the swirling darkness. After what felt like an eternity, they reached it. A narrow, hidden ledge near the summit, offering a commanding, secret view of the entire fortified pass below. The sky to the east was just beginning to blush with the first hint of dawn. Down below, Jedediah's fortress was stirring to life, torches moving like fireflies in the gloom. Elias positioned himself at the edge of the ledge. He looked at Clara and Nita, a silent question in his eyes. They both gave a firm, almost imperceptible nod. This was the point of no return. He raised his Winchester, aimed it at the sky, and fired. The single shot was sharp and clear in the thin mountain air. It echoed down the canyon, a lone crack of thunder heralding the coming storm. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, down in the workers' camp, a roar went up. It started with one man, O'Malley, and spread like wildfire. A wave of humanity surged from the tents. Men armed with pickaxes, sledgehammers, and burning brands poured into the main thoroughfare. They were no longer slaves. They were an army of the enraged. They fell upon the first line of guards, a chaotic, brutal tide of rebellion. A supply wagon was overturned and set ablaze, the flames leaping into the dawn sky, a signal of open war. From her perch, Nita saw her moment. Jedediah's men on the canyon walls turned their attention to the riot below, confused and caught off guard. Nita drew her first arrow. Her target was a Gatling gun emplacement on the opposite cliff, its operator swinging the deadly weapon towards the rioting workers. Nita's bow sang. The arrow crossed the chasm and found the operator's chest. He slumped over the gun, silenced. The battle for the Devil's Backbone had begun. "Go!" Elias yelled. While the main force was pinned down by the uprising and Nita's arrows, Elias and Clara began their own desperate descent into the heart of the fortress. They scrambled down a less guarded slope, using the chaos as their shield. They moved through the camp, a blur of motion amidst the shouting and gunfire. They reached a fork in the path. "The command post is that way," Elias said, pointing towards a larger, fortified tent at the highest point of the camp. "The dynamite should be in the main supply depot, just below it." He looked at Clara, his face grim. "No mistakes." "There won't be," she said, her voice steady. They split up. Clara ran, her heart pounding towards the supply depot. It was a long, low building made of thick timber, with two of Jedediah's guards standing at the single reinforced door. They were distracted, their attention on the riot below. Clara circled around the back, finding a small, high window used for ventilation. Using a stack of discarded crates, she climbed, squeezed through the narrow opening, and dropped into the dusty darkness inside. The air was thick with the chemical smell of dynamite. Crates of it were stacked from floor to ceiling. There was enough explosive power in this room to level a small town. She found what she was looking for: a cluster of several large crates connected with detonator cords, clearly meant for a massive, strategic blast. Working quickly, her hands remembering the lessons Elias had taught her about fuses and blasting caps, she prepared her charge. She cut a long fuse, giving herself as much time as she dared. Her hands were shaking, but her mind was a shard of ice. Outside, Elias fought his way up the slope towards Jedediah's tent. He was a whirlwind of controlled violence. He moved from cover to cover, his Colt speaking in deafening roars. He faced Jedediah's personal guard, that men handpicked for their loyalty and brutality. It was a grueling, close-quarters battle. He took a bullet graze to his shoulder and a knife slash to his leg, but he kept moving forward, fueled by a cold, righteous fury he hadn't felt since the day he lost his family. He was no longer just a man seeking redemption. He was an instrument of it. He kicked the last guard away from the tent's entrance, his body battered and bruised, and faced the closed flap of Jedediah's command post. Back in the depot, Clara finished her work. The fuse was set. She took out a match, her knuckles white. She struck it against the rough wood of a crate. The flame sputtered to life. She touched it to the end of the fuse. It caught, hissing like a serpent as it began its slow, inexorable journey towards detonation. She turned to flee, back towards the window, but her heart stopped. The two guards, alerted by the sounds of her work, were standing in the doorway, their pistols raised, their faces a mixture of shock and fury. She was trapped in a room with a burning fuse and enough dynamite to send her, and half this mountain, to Kingdom Come. At that same moment, Elias Thorne kicked open the flap of the command tent. The scene inside was not one of chaos. It was eerily calm. Jedediah Kane sat behind a large table, a map of his planned empire spread before him. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't panicked. He looked up from the map, and in his hands, he held a massive double-barreled shotgun. He smiled, a slow, chilling smile of a man who has been waiting patiently for the final bloody act to begin. "Thorn?" Jedediah Kane rumbled, his voice as heavy as gravestones. "I was wondering when you'd arrive. Come in. Close the door. Let's finish this." Clara's mind worked with the terrifying clarity that only mortal peril can provide. The hissing fuse was a countdown to her own oblivion. The two guards in the doorway were her executioners. She couldn't fight them, so she used the only weapon she had left, fear. "Dynamite!" she screamed, her voice piercing and raw. "The whole depot is wired. It's going to blow." For a critical second, the guards hesitated. They looked from her terrified face to the sputtering fuse snaking its way towards the mountain of crates. Greed and loyalty vanished, replaced by the primal animal instinct to survive. One of them turned and ran, screaming a warning to the others. The second guard raised his pistol, but his eyes were fixed on the fuse. That hesitation was his last mistake. Clara didn't wait. She grabbed a heavy, discarded mallet from the floor and hurled it with all her might, not at the guard, but at a shelf laden with unstable lanterns and cans of oil. The shelf collapsed in a shower of glass and flammable liquid, creating a wall of fire between her and the guard. While he recoiled from the sudden inferno, Clara scrambled out the window, dropping hard to the ground outside just as the depot erupted. The explosion was not a sound. It was the end of sound. A wave of pure force tore through the heart of the fortress, lifting the massive timber building into the air and turning it into a million flying splinters. A secondary, earth-shattering detonation followed as the rest of the dynamite cooked off. The blast wave ripped through the camp, leveling tents, overturning wagons, and sending men flying like ragdolls. It was a man-made apocalypse. It was Clara's victory. Inside the command tent, the duel between Elias and Jedediah was a brutal ballet of desperation. Jedediah was a force of nature, a bear swatting at a wolf. He swung the heavy shotgun like a club, its stock splintering against a support beam where Elias's head had been moments before. Elias was faster, more experienced, but he was wounded and tiring. He used the table, the chairs, anything he could to keep space between himself and the monster. "My brother tried to outthink them," Jedediah roared, advancing relentlessly. "He was a fool. There is no problem in this world that cannot be solved with sufficient force." He lunged, grabbing Elias and lifting him from the floor, squeezing the air from his lungs. Elias's vision began to tunnel. He slammed the butt of his empty Colt against Jedediah's temple, but it was like hitting granite. Jedediah laughed, his grip tightening. It was at that precise moment that Clara's dynamite turned the world to white fire. The shockwave hit the command tent like a fist from God. The ground heaved, and the thick canvas was torn from its moorings. The heavy central pole of the tent cracked and came crashing down, striking Jedediah a glancing blow on the shoulder. His grip on Elias faltered. Both men were thrown to the ground. Elias landed near the overturned table, where Jedediah's prized map of his future empire lay smoldering. Jedediah recovered first, shaking his massive head to clear it. He saw his shotgun lying a few feet away and lunged for it. But Elias had seen something else. One of the heavy, ornate paperweights holding down the map, a jagged piece of iron ore. As Jedediah reached for his weapon, Elias grabbed the rock and threw himself forward, bringing the sharp edge down with all his remaining strength onto the back of Jedediah's skull. Jedediah Kane, the would-be emperor, the man who believed in nothing but force, fell face first into the dirt and lay still. The hammer was broken. The great beast was dead. The explosion and the death of their leader shattered the last of the outlaws' resolve. The few who were not killed or wounded threw down their weapons as O'Malley's enraged workers swarmed over them. From the cliffs, Nita watched as the last pockets of resistance crumbled. She lowered her bow. The poison was cleansed. The balance, paid for in blood and fire, was restored. The smoke began to clear, revealing a scene of utter devastation under the setting sun. The survivors moved through the wreckage like ghosts. Elias, leaning heavily on a broken wagon wheel, found Clara near the crater where the depot had once stood. They looked at each other, too exhausted for words. They had done it. They had survived. Nita appeared beside them, as silent as ever. She looked at Elias's wounds and simply handed him a pouch of herbs. "Chew these," she said. "They will stop the bleeding and dull the pain." The three of them stood together, watching as the first of the real lawmen, drawn by the sound of a full-scale war, began to ride cautiously into the pass. O'Malley and his men were celebrated as heroes. The story of the uprising and of the three mysterious figures who had led the charge would quickly become the stuff of legend. A week later, the Devil's Backbone was a different place. The U.S. Army had arrived to secure the pass, and the railroad company, represented by grateful, suit-wearing men from the East, was already planning its reconstruction. They offered Clara a fortune in reward money. She refused most of it, asking only for a small portion and that the rest be used to fairly compensate O'Malley's men. But she did accept their other offer. Impressed by her intellect and steely resolve, they offered her a position not as a governess, but as a logistical consultant for the rebuilding effort in Santa Fe. "We need people who understand how this country really works, Miss Jenkins," the chief engineer told her, "not just how it looks on a map." Clara accepted. Her future would not be an escape from her past, but a testament to it. She would build just as her father had. Nita came to say her goodbyes one evening as the sun set, painting the high peaks in shades of orange and deep purple. "The Iron Road will come now," she said, her voice holding no judgment, only a deep, ancient sadness. "The world of men will cover everything." "Where will you go?" Elias asked. "North," she answered, her gaze on the far horizon. "To the high places, where the mountains have no names and the land has no fences. There is still wilderness left, Thorne. You just have to know where to look." She placed a hand on Clara's shoulder, then looked at Elias. A rare, faint smile touched her lips. "Live well, lawman," she said. Then she turned and walked away, and the rocks and shadows simply took her back. Elias, his arm in a sling, his body a collection of aches and pains, stood watching her go. Sheriff Miller and a territorial governor had offered him anything he wanted: a permanent marshal's star, a command of his own, a pension that would let him live out his days in comfort. He refused it all. He had found his peace, but it wasn't in a badge or a bottle. It was in the fight itself. It was in the act of standing for something. O'Malley approached him. "What now, Thorne?" the big Irishman asked. "You gonna ride off into the sunset, like in them dime novels?" Elias looked at the new, bustling community of workers, soldiers, and engineers beginning to take shape in the pass. He looked at the determined set of Clara's jaw as she argued a point with an engineer. He looked at the vast, beautiful, and dangerous land he had helped save. "No," Elias said, a real, genuine smile finally reaching his eyes. "I think I'm tired of riding." He looked at O'Malley. "You'll need good men to keep this place safe. Not lawmen, just good men." O'Malley grinned, understanding. "That I will." The story of Elias Thorne did not end with him becoming a legend. It ended with him becoming a man, a carpenter, a neighbor, a quiet, watchful presence in a new town being born from the ashes of a war he had helped win. He would watch the trains come through the pass, a symbol not of an invading force, but of the future he had secured. Some nights, he would sit on his porch and look up at the high peaks, and he would wonder if Nita was out there, watching the same last sunset. He no longer felt the ghosts of his wife and daughter at his back. He felt only the cool, clean air of the mountains, and for the first time in his life, he felt at home.